Hey Flash Historian subscribers! Tonight, we step into the steaming, noisy, wonderfully chaotic world of ancient Roman bathhouses. A place where Romans claimed they came to relax, but somehow always ended up arguing about politics, gambling away coins, hearing shocking gossip, and sitting shoulder to shoulder with hundreds of extremely sweaty strangers. So before you settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy wandering through history with me. And let me know down in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there right now. I always love seeing how far these sleepy little journeys travel around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe crack open a window for a cool breeze, and let's slowly drift back into the warm marble halls of ancient Rome together. If there was one place Romans truly believed could solve every problem in life, it was the public bathhouse. Lost money gambling? Go to the baths. Political disaster? Baths. Family argument? Baths. Existential dread caused by living in a collapsing apartment above a fish market? Definitely baths. Roman society treated public bathing less like hygiene and more like a full-time lifestyle. For many ordinary Romans, home was not exactly peaceful. Most citizens lived inside crowded apartment buildings called insulae, towering structures packed tightly together with thin walls, smoky kitchens, screaming neighbors, crying babies, barking dogs, and the constant smell of cooking oil mixed with sewage drifting through the streets. Privacy barely existed. Silence certainly did not. So every afternoon, enormous crowds poured toward the bathhouses searching for comfort, entertainment, conversation, and perhaps the illusion that life was temporarily under control. And these bathhouses were gigantic. Not small little pools tucked quietly into corners, but sprawling public complexes filled with hot rooms, warm baths, freezing plunge pools, exercise courtyards, gardens, libraries, fountains, massage rooms, snack vendors, and endless corridors echoing with human noise. Imagine a shopping mall, sports center, spa, social club, and political convention all squeezed together into one steaming marble labyrinth. The rich arrived dramatically, of course. Wealthy Romans entered surrounded by servants carrying oils, towels, perfumes, fresh clothing, and sandals. Some aristocrats treated the baths like fashion runways, carefully displaying expensive jewelry while pretending they were naturally elegant beings blessed directly by Jupiter himself. Poor Romans entered carrying far less dignity and significantly fewer servants, but once inside, everyone shared the same baths, the same pools, and unfortunately, often the same questionable water. Roman equality had limits, but bacteria ignored social class beautifully. The experience usually began with exercise. Men wrestled, boxed, lifted weights, played ball games, or jogged through courtyards while philosophers nearby judged them silently for caring about muscles. Roman writers constantly complained about the noise. One exhausted philosopher described hearing grunting athletes, splashing water, shouting trainers, singing bath attendants, slapping massages, and arguments erupting over absolutely nothing. Imagine attempting to meditate while someone nearby screams about olive prices and another man insists his chariot racing faction was cheated 3 races in a row. After exercising, Romans covered themselves in olive oil instead of soap. Then servants scraped the oil, dirt, sweat, and dust from their skin using curved metal tools called strigils. It was essentially a civilized method of turning yourself into a greasy roast chicken before aggressively removing the seasoning. And naturally, the baths became one of Rome's greatest social centers. Business deals happened there. Political alliances formed there. Friendships began there. Gossip spread there faster than disease. Senators discussed government matters while floating half-submerged beside merchants, laborers, retired soldiers, and one loud man who had definitely consumed too much wine before noon. Some Romans visited simply to hear rumors. Bathhouses functioned almost like living newspapers. News about military victories, scandals, elections, crimes, celebrity gladiators, and embarrassing affairs traveled rapidly through steaming rooms filled with half-listening citizens pretending not to eavesdrop while absolutely eavesdropping. Food vendors wandered through the halls selling bread, olives, wine, pastries, and hot snacks. Gamblers rolled dice in hidden corners despite laws against gambling. Musicians performed for coins. Massage attendants advertised loudly. And somewhere in nearly every bathhouse, at least one man was passionately losing an argument about horse racing statistics nobody else cared about. Bathhouses also gave Romans something they feared deeply: being alone with their thoughts. Ancient Rome was loud, crowded, competitive, and stressful. The empire demanded constant work, social climbing, networking, and public performance. The baths offered escape, or at least distraction wrapped in steam and conversation. And perhaps that was the true genius of Roman bath culture. The baths were not really about getting clean. They were about staying entertained. In ancient Rome, boredom was considered almost unacceptable. Life needed noise, spectacle, conversation, drama, and movement at all times. So Romans gathered together every afternoon inside vast marble chambers filled with heat, gossip, laughter, arguments, wine, ambition, and enough humidity to make breathing feel optional. And honestly, after a long exhausting day in ancient Rome, sitting in warm water while overhearing a senator accidentally ruin his political career beside a bread vendor probably sounded like a pretty decent evening. Writing. Drinking and gambling in ancient Roman taverns was less of a hobby and more of a full-contact survival activity with wine involved. Every evening, as the sun dipped behind the crowded rooftops of Rome, taverns flooded with exhausted workers, noisy merchants, off-duty soldiers, sailors, laborers, and wealthy young aristocrats pretending they understood the common people, while dramatically overpaying for watered-down wine. Roman taverns were loud, cramped, smoky places tucked along busy streets and alleyways. Most were small, dark rooms with wooden tables stained by years of spilled wine, grease, sweat, and arguments that escalated far beyond their original purpose. The air smelled like smoke, cheap alcohol, olive oil, stale bread, and humanity making poor decisions in confined spaces. And the wine flowed constantly. Romans drank wine with almost every meal, but taverns transformed drinking into an evening performance. Huge ceramic jugs lined the counters while tavern keepers diluted wine with water before serving it. Drinking unmixed wine was considered uncivilized by Romans, though after several cups, most customers became uncivilized anyway. Some taverns served decent wine imported from across the empire. Others served liquids so suspicious that customers probably spent half the night wondering whether they were drunk or slowly dissolving internally. Roman writers frequently mocked tavern wine for tasting like vinegar mixed with regret. And naturally, wherever Romans gathered to drink, gambling followed immediately behind like an old friend with terrible advice. Dice games dominated tavern life. Small cubes carved from bone, ivory, or wood clattered endlessly across tables while gamblers shouted, cursed the gods, accused each other of cheating, and confidently promised they would stop after just one more throw, a sentence humanity has apparently repeated for thousands of years unchanged. Poor Romans gambled small amounts. A few coins. A meal. Maybe a cheap cloak. Wealthier Romans approached gambling with the emotional self-control of men actively trying to ruin their own lives. Some lost jewelry, horses, furniture, or entire chunks of property over a single disastrous evening. Imagine waking up the next morning and realizing your vineyard now legally belongs to a man named Titus because you got overconfident during a dice game beside a wine barrel. Cheating became such a problem that Roman authorities repeatedly tried to crack down on gambling. Loaded dice appeared everywhere. Tavern owners sometimes worked with professional gamblers who manipulated games to drain drunk customers of money as efficiently as possible. Certain gamblers became infamous for suspiciously impossible luck while smiling the entire time like villains in low-budget theater productions. Fights broke out constantly. Roman taverns were not peaceful little pubs where people politely discussed philosophy over drinks. These were emotional pressure cookers filled with alcohol, pride, gambling losses, political arguments, and men carrying knives. A bad dice roll, an insult, or simply looking at someone too long could trigger screaming matches, broken furniture, and occasionally a level of violence wildly disproportionate to the original disagreement. Roman poets and historians constantly complained about tavern behavior. Respectable citizens claimed taverns were full of criminals, drunkards, thieves, prostitutes, and degenerates. Which, judging by surviving records, was honestly a pretty accurate description. And yet even wealthy Romans kept visiting them anyway because boredom terrified Roman society almost as much as sobriety did. Music, singing, and performances often filled the evenings. Musicians played flutes or string instruments while drunk customers shouted along terribly. Storytellers entertained crowds with gossip, rumors, and exaggerated tales about gladiators, emperors, military victories, or scandalous affairs involving people important enough to ruin your life if they overheard you repeating them. And perhaps most importantly, taverns gave ordinary Romans a temporary escape from daily exhaustion. Rome was crowded, stressful, noisy, and brutally unequal. Most people worked long hours in difficult conditions. Taverns offered warmth, distraction, conversation, and the comforting illusion that maybe losing money gambling while drunk beside strangers somehow counted as relaxation. In ancient Rome, entertainment did not require comfort, safety, or dignity. Sometimes all you needed was cheap wine, rolling dice, terrible decisions, and enough noise to forget your problems until tomorrow morning arrived carrying a headache powerful enough to anger the gods themselves. Watching gladiator fights after daily work was one of ancient Rome's favorite ways to relax, which says an incredible amount about Roman society, and almost none of it is emotionally healthy. After long exhausting days spent building roads, hauling cargo, managing shops, arguing in markets, collecting taxes, or surviving overcrowded apartment buildings that smelled like smoke and wet cabbage, thousands of Romans flooded toward massive arenas searching for excitement, distraction, violence, and the comforting realization that at least someone else was having a worse day than they were. For ordinary citizens, gladiator games were not rare special occasions. They were a central part of Roman entertainment culture. Amphitheaters existed across the empire, from enormous arenas in Rome itself to smaller provincial cities where local officials hosted spectacles to impress crowds and gain popularity. The most famous of all was the Colosseum, a gigantic stone arena capable of holding tens of thousands of screaming spectators packed tightly together beneath the blazing Mediterranean sun. And Romans absolutely loved it. The games usually began early in the morning, but the largest crowds often arrived later in the day after finishing work. Laborers, merchants, craftsmen, soldiers, slaves, senators, and aristocrats all poured through the entrances together, climbing endless staircases toward their assigned seats. Roman seating arrangements reflected their obsession with social hierarchy. The wealthy sat comfortably near the arena floor where they could clearly watch every dramatic moment. Poor citizens sat higher above, packed tightly together on stone benches that probably felt like punishment after several hours. Women were often seated separately in upper sections, while slaves and foreigners occupied the least desirable areas. Even during public entertainment, Rome remained deeply committed to reminding everyone exactly where they belonged socially. Outside the arena, vendors sold food, wine, bread, olives, roasted meat, pastries, and cheap souvenirs. Crowds shouted, argued, laughed, and placed bets before the fights even started. The atmosphere resembled a gigantic sporting event mixed with a political rally and just enough public danger to keep everything exciting. Roman citizens discussed favorite gladiators the same way modern fans discuss athletes or celebrities. Certain fighters became wildly popular, attracting loyal supporters, romantic admirers, and aggressive fan groups who argued endlessly about fighting styles and famous victories. Some gladiators specialized in speed and agility. Others fought heavily armored with shields and swords. Certain matches intentionally paired dramatically different fighting styles together for maximum entertainment value. One gladiator might carry a trident and net while facing another equipped with heavy armor and a short sword. Romans loved contrast, suspense, and the possibility that absolutely anything could happen once the gates opened. Before the fighting began, gladiators often marched into the arena in dramatic processions while crowds roared with excitement. Trumpets echoed through the stadium. Wealthy officials presided over the games from decorated platforms while servants shaded them from the heat with large cloth canopies. Emperors sometimes attended personally, understanding perfectly well that free entertainment helped keep enormous populations distracted, loyal, and less interested in inconvenient topics like corruption or taxes. Rome mastered public spectacle long before modern governments discovered fireworks and televised sports. And then the violence began. Contrary to popular imagination, gladiator fights were not always immediate death matches where everyone died within minutes. Gladiators were expensive to train, feed, and maintain. Skilled fighters represented valuable investments, especially successful ones who attracted large audiences. Many matches focused more on endurance, skill, drama, and spectacle rather than automatic execution. But even so, the fights remained brutally dangerous. Broken bones, deep wounds, permanent injuries, and horrifying deaths were common enough that spectators fully expected blood as part of the experience. Crowds reacted emotionally to every moment. They shouted encouragement, insults, betting predictions, and demands for violence loud enough to shake the stone walls of the arena itself. Some spectators became deeply attached to favorite gladiators, celebrating victories wildly and mourning losses with surprising sincerity considering they were emotionally investing in organized public combat. Roman graffiti discovered centuries later includes messages praising famous fighters almost like modern sports fans praising star athletes. And for many exhausted workers sitting high above the arena after difficult days, the games provided temporary escape from ordinary life. Rome was overcrowded, stressful, unequal, noisy, and politically unstable. Gladiator games transformed those frustrations into collective entertainment. Inside the arena, daily struggles disappeared beneath roaring crowds, flashing weapons, dramatic music, and carefully staged violence designed to overwhelm the senses completely. The games also reflected Roman values in uncomfortable ways. Romans admired discipline, courage, endurance, and public performance above almost everything else. Gladiators embodied those qualities dramatically. Even enslaved fighters could achieve fame, admiration, and occasionally freedom through repeated victories. Crowds respected bravery intensely. A gladiator who fought courageously, even in defeat, could earn enormous admiration from spectators who spent most of their own lives trapped within rigid social systems offering little personal glory whatsoever. But the spectacle extended beyond gladiator duels. Large events included wild animal hunts featuring lions, bears, leopards, elephants, and exotic creatures imported from distant provinces across Africa and Asia. Crowds watched hunters battle dangerous animals while announcers described the wonders of Rome's vast empire. Executions of criminals sometimes occurred publicly during intermissions, because Roman entertainment believed strongly in maintaining consistent energy throughout the day. The arena itself became a social world. Friends gathered together regularly. Business deals happened between events. Politicians watched crowd reactions carefully. Vendors shouted constantly. Gamblers moved through the seating areas collecting bets. Wealthy spectators displayed expensive clothing and jewelry while poorer citizens simply enjoyed escaping cramped apartments and exhausting routines for a few hours. Roman writers often criticized the games while secretly remaining fascinated by them. Some philosophers argued the spectacles encouraged cruelty and moral decay. Others admitted reluctantly that the excitement was difficult to resist. One Roman intellectual complained that after attending the games, he felt humanity becoming more violent simply from watching the crowd enjoy bloodshed so enthusiastically. Which honestly sounds like a man discovering sports fans for the first time and becoming deeply alarmed by the entire concept. And yet the games continued for centuries because they solved one of Rome's greatest fears: boredom. Ancient Roman society demanded constant stimulation. Public entertainment became essential social glue holding enormous populations together through spectacle, emotion, distraction, and collective experience. After exhausting days of work, Romans did not necessarily want peace or quiet. They wanted noise, excitement, drama, gossip, competition, and giant crowds screaming while two heavily armed men attempted to hit each other with sharp metal objects inside a massive stone arena. In many ways, gladiator games served the same emotional purpose modern entertainment serves today. They distracted people from stress. They created celebrities and rivalries. They gave strangers shared experiences to discuss afterward. They transformed ordinary evenings into memorable events filled with emotion and spectacle. The methods were simply, significantly more lethal. And as the sun slowly lowered behind the towering walls of the Colosseum, thousands of tired Romans eventually returned home through crowded streets carrying leftover food, gambling losses, dramatic stories, strong opinions about referee decisions that absolutely did not exist yet, and the strange comforting feeling that tomorrow would probably bring another long exhausting day followed by another evening of noise, spectacle, wine, and glorious distraction inside the greatest entertainment machine the ancient world had ever built. Attending chariot races at the Circus Maximus was one of ancient Rome's favorite ways to escape work, responsibility, and occasionally basic human self-control. After long exhausting days spent sweating through crowded markets, noisy workshops, military camps, government offices, or apartment buildings held together mostly by optimism and water damage, Romans flooded toward the largest stadium in the empire searching for speed, violence, gambling, political chaos, and the emotional stability of screaming at professional athletes traveling dangerously fast around sharp corners. And no place delivered that madness better than the Circus Maximus. The Circus Maximus was enormous. Absolutely absurdly enormous. Stretching through the valley between two Roman hills, the stadium could hold well over 100,000 spectators, possibly far more during major events. Imagine a structure so massive that the noise of the crowd alone sounded like an approaching storm rolling across the city. Roman engineers built roads, aqueducts, temples, and military fortresses across continents. Then they looked at all those achievements and said, "Excellent. Now let's build a gigantic racetrack where men risk death while rich citizens scream about horse teams." Which, honestly, explains Rome surprisingly well. Race days transformed the entire city. Crowds poured through the streets before sunrise carrying food, wine, cushions, betting money, and enough emotional investment to destroy friendships over horse-related disagreements. Vendors lined the roads selling bread, olives, sausages, pastries, watered wine, and suspicious meat products nobody questioned too carefully because excitement had already overwhelmed common sense hours earlier. Inside the stadium, the atmosphere was absolute chaos. Thousands upon thousands of Romans packed tightly into massive seating sections divided by class and status. Senators sat in privileged areas close to the track while ordinary citizens climbed higher into crowded rows that offered less comfort but significantly louder shouting opportunities. Women attended races too, unlike certain other public events where Roman society preferred pretending women did not enjoy entertainment despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary. And everyone chose sides. Chariot racing factions dominated Roman social life with a level of intensity modern sports fans would deeply respect and perhaps find slightly concerning. The four main racing teams were identified by colors red, white, blue, and green. Supporters treated these factions less like athletic teams and more like full emotional identities. Fans argued constantly about drivers, horses, race strategies, cheating accusations, and conspiracy theories involving officials, wealthy sponsors, or divine intervention. Romans absolutely lost their minds over these teams. Friendships collapsed over faction rivalries. Families argued endlessly. Crowds rioted after controversial races. Some emperors openly favored specific teams, which naturally encouraged even more political tension because apparently Rome believed every single activity should contain at least some possibility of public instability. The Greens and Blues became especially powerful over time, attracting massive loyal fanbases across the empire. Fans wore faction colors proudly, placed reckless bets, and screamed themselves hoarse during races. Imagine modern football supporters combined with political extremists and gambling addicts, all packed into a gigantic stadium under brutal summer heat while horses thundered past at terrifying speeds. That was basically a normal Roman afternoon. And the races themselves were genuinely dangerous. Each race featured lightweight chariots pulled by teams of horses charging around the track at incredible speed while drivers balanced precariously behind them wearing little protective armor. The central barrier dividing the track forced competitors into tight deadly turns where crashes happened constantly. Wheels shattered. Horses collided. Chariots flipped violently into clouds of dust and splintered wood while crowds roared with excitement instead of concern because Roman entertainment standards operated on a completely different moral operating system. Drivers sometimes became tangled in reins during crashes and were dragged behind panicked horses around the track. Successful racers carried knives specifically to cut themselves free before becoming ancient human road decorations. Which really tells you everything about Roman workplace safety regulations. And despite the danger, successful charioteers became celebrities on a scale difficult to exaggerate. Famous drivers earned enormous fortunes, luxury homes, political influence, and passionate fan followings across the empire. Graffiti praising favorite racers appeared throughout Roman cities. Crowds worshipped successful champions almost like modern movie stars or athletes. Some drivers earned more money than senators while surviving careers built entirely around traveling at horrifying speeds inches away from violent death. One particularly famous charioteer reportedly won thousands of races and accumulated wealth so massive it rivaled fortunes of elite aristocrats. Imagine becoming one of the richest people in Rome because you mastered the ancient equivalent of weaponized horse drifting. Gambling surrounded every race. Bets changed hands constantly before and during competitions. Spectators wagered coins, jewelry, property, livestock, and occasionally sums of money large enough to financially traumatize entire families. Some Romans studied horses and drivers obsessively searching for betting advantages while others simply chose teams emotionally and prayed the gods appreciated reckless optimism. Naturally, cheating accusations exploded constantly. Fans blamed losses on corrupt officials, bribed racers, cursed horses, unfair starting positions, sabotage, bad omens, suspicious weather, or literally anything except poor betting decisions. Human beings, remarkably, have changed very little in 2,000 years. But chariot races were more than entertainment. They acted as giant social pressure valves for Roman society. Rome was crowded, unequal, stressful, and politically dangerous. The Circus Maximus gave enormous populations a place to release emotions publicly through collective excitement, screaming, celebration, outrage, gambling, and shared obsession. For a few hours, daily struggles disappeared beneath thunderous hooves and roaring crowds. Politicians understood this perfectly. Emperors sponsored races constantly because keeping citizens entertained helped prevent unrest. Free food and public games became central tools of Roman government. Historians later described this strategy as bread and circuses, essentially distracting the population with entertainment while hoping nobody looked too closely at deeper political problems. Which, if we are being honest, remains a surprisingly durable governing strategy throughout human history. And perhaps most importantly, the races cured boredom. Romans feared boredom almost professionally. Silence felt suspicious. Stillness felt unnatural. Life needed noise, competition, drama, arguments, crowds, and spectacle. The Circus Maximus delivered all of it at maximum volume while horses sprinted dangerously close to disaster in front of tens of thousands of emotionally unstable spectators holding gambling debts. As evening finally approached and exhausted crowds spilled back into Rome's crowded streets, citizens carried home betting losses, race gossip, faction arguments, food stains, hoarse voices, and endless debates about controversial turns that would continue loudly inside taverns and bathhouses late into the night. And somewhere deep inside the empire, another Roman citizen was already waking up the next morning thinking the exact same thing every racing fan throughout history eventually thinks after financial disaster and emotional exhaustion. Yes, but maybe next race will be different. Gossiping and debating in the Roman Forum was one of ancient Rome's favorite daily activities, because if there was one thing Romans loved almost as much as public entertainment, it was loudly discussing other people's problems in crowded spaces while pretending they personally understood politics better than everyone else around them. Every morning and afternoon, enormous crowds poured into the Roman Forum, the beating heart of the city itself. This was not simply a marketplace or government center. It was the social engine of Rome, a chaotic mixture of politics, business, religion, entertainment, arguments, scandals, rumors, legal disputes, philosophical speeches, shopping, flirting, and endless public noise bouncing between marble buildings under the Mediterranean sun. The Forum sat surrounded by temples, government halls, statues, arches, and administrative buildings, all packed tightly together like Rome had attempted to fit the entire concept of civilization into one overcrowded stone rectangle. Senators walked beside merchants. Priests crossed paths with gamblers. Lawyers shouted over street vendors. Wealthy aristocrats moved carefully through crowds of laborers, travelers, soldiers, beggars, slaves, and tourists from distant provinces trying not to look overwhelmed by the sheer intensity of Roman public life. And absolutely everyone talked. Romans treated conversation almost like a competitive sport. Silence in public spaces was rare and deeply suspicious. Every corner of the Forum echoed with debates about politics, military campaigns, taxes, scandals, elections, philosophy, business deals, chariot races, gladiators, religious omens, and whichever wealthy citizen had recently embarrassed himself in spectacular fashion. News traveled through Rome at astonishing speed, mostly because thousands of citizens spent entire afternoons aggressively spreading it. The Forum functioned as the empire's unofficial information network. Long before newspapers or social media existed, Romans gathered daily to exchange rumors, accusations, theories, complaints, and dramatic exaggerations presented with complete confidence regardless of accuracy. One merchant might casually mention grain shortages in Egypt. Another man nearby would immediately transform that into a story about economic collapse, government corruption, divine punishment, and possible invasion before lunchtime even arrived. Human civilization invented gossip almost immediately after inventing language itself. Rome simply perfected the scale of it. Political debate dominated Forum life. Roman citizens loved arguing publicly about government decisions while surrounded by crowds equally convinced they possessed superior political wisdom. Orators climbed platforms delivering speeches about military victories, public morality, economic policy, corruption, or the terrifying possibility that Rome itself was slowly losing its traditional values, a concern Romans expressed continuously for several centuries while continuing to conquer enormous portions of the known world anyway. Crowds gathered instantly around skilled speakers. Some citizens genuinely cared about politics. Others simply enjoyed the drama. Public speeches often resembled theatrical performances complete with shouting, emotional gestures, insults directed toward rivals, and carefully timed pauses designed to provoke applause from supporters. Roman politicians understood perfectly that entertaining crowds mattered almost as much as actual governing. And naturally, arguments erupted constantly. Romans debated everything. Which senator was corrupt? Which general deserved more glory? Which emperor secretly behaved like an idiot? Whether taxes were unfair. Whether traditional Roman values were disappearing. Whether certain gods seemed unusually angry lately. Whether gladiator games were becoming too violent or not violent enough somehow. Small disagreements regularly transformed into enormous shouting matches involving entire crowds of emotionally invested strangers. Philosophers argued with merchants. Veterans argued with politicians. Wealthy aristocrats argued with absolutely everyone because many genuinely believed expensive clothing automatically improved their intelligence. The Forum also became Rome's greatest stage for public humiliation. Reputation mattered enormously in Roman society, and embarrassing rumors spread through the Forum with terrifying speed. Affairs, gambling debts, failed business deals, cowardice, corruption scandals, and disastrous speeches became public knowledge almost instantly. Some Romans arrived at the Forum mainly to discover whose social life had collapsed since yesterday afternoon. Graffiti covered nearby walls with insults, jokes, political slogans, and sarcastic commentary about famous citizens. Romans loved mockery. Sharp humor became an important survival skill in crowded urban life where maintaining dignity required constant effort and usually failed anyway. Street performers wandered through the forum entertaining crowds between debates and business deals. Musicians played instruments while storytellers performed dramatic tales about heroes, emperors, gods, or local scandals disguised only slightly enough to avoid immediate arrest. Vendors sold food, wine, perfumes, scrolls, charms, jewelry, and suspicious miracle cures guaranteed to solve problems ranging from headaches to romantic failure. And for ordinary Romans, the Forum offered escape from boredom and isolation. Many citizens lived in cramped apartments with little privacy and few comforts. The Forum provided movement, excitement, human connection, entertainment, and the comforting realization that thousands of other people were also confused, stressed, angry, ambitious, and desperately pretending to understand what was happening around them. Even wealthy Romans spent hours there because public visibility mattered deeply in Roman culture. To disappear from public life risked social irrelevance. Important citizens needed to be seen, heard, admired, feared, envied, or at minimum discussed loudly by strangers standing near fruit vendors. The Forum was messy, crowded, loud, politically unstable, emotionally exhausting, and absolutely essential to Roman life. It represented the empire itself, ambitious, dramatic, chaotic, proud, deeply unequal, endlessly argumentative, and permanently addicted to spectacle. And as the sun slowly lowered behind temples and marble columns, citizens drifted home carrying fresh rumors, unfinished arguments, political outrage, business opportunities, emotional exhaustion, and several entirely unverified stories they fully intended to repeat tomorrow morning as absolute undeniable truth. Hosting lavish dinner parties and banquets in ancient Rome was not simply about eating food. It was about displaying wealth, humiliating rivals, building political alliances, spreading gossip, showing off exotic ingredients, and convincing everyone around you that your life was vastly more successful and sophisticated than theirs. Roman elites treated dinner parties like competitive theater with wine involved and occasionally peacocks. As the sun began setting over Rome, wealthy citizens prepared for evenings of carefully organized excess. Servants rushed through enormous villas lighting oil lamps, arranging couches, polishing silver dishes, preparing wines, and carrying platters of expensive food through hallways filled with the smell of roasted meat, perfume, olive oil, and ambitious social climbing. For rich Romans, banquets were one of the most important social events in daily life. Invitations mattered enormously. Being invited to the right dinner could improve political careers, create business opportunities, secure marriages, or raise someone's social reputation overnight. Not being invited could feel like a public insult severe enough to fuel resentment for months. Roman aristocrats measured social status partly by whose dining room they were allowed to enter. Guests usually arrived dressed in elegant clothing while servants removed sandals and washed their feet before the meal. Most wealthy Romans ate while reclining on cushioned couches arranged around low tables, because apparently conquering half the known world convinced Rome that sitting upright during dinner was simply too exhausting. Guests leaned sideways while eating, drinking wine, talking loudly, and occasionally dropping food directly onto expensive floors servants would later clean. Civilization was progressing magnificently. And the food itself became a performance. Ordinary Romans survived mostly on bread, olives, vegetables, porridge, and simple meals. Elite banquets, however, transformed dining into an extravagant spectacle designed to overwhelm guests completely. Exotic foods arrived constantly throughout the evening. Roasted boar, seafood, oysters, dormice, flamingo tongues, imported spices, elaborate pastries, stuffed birds, and expensive sauces covered banquet tables while hosts carefully observed reactions searching for admiration. Romans became obsessed with rare ingredients. Wealthy hosts competed aggressively to serve foods nobody else could afford or even recognize. Exotic fish became status symbols. Some aristocrats paid enormous fortunes for rare seafood transported across the empire simply to impress dinner guests for a few hours. Roman writers regularly mocked rich citizens for spending absurd amounts of money on meals while pretending this behavior represented refined culture rather than emotional instability with seasoning. And naturally, wine flowed endlessly. Roman banquets involved staggering amounts of drinking. Servants constantly refilled cups while musicians played softly in the background and conversations grew louder, messier, and significantly less intelligent as the night continued. Wine was usually mixed with water, though some guests drank stronger mixtures specifically to accelerate terrible decision-making. Drunken arguments, emotional speeches, philosophical debates, and deeply unnecessary storytelling became normal features of elite dining culture. Entertainment filled the evening. Musicians performed songs while poets recited dramatic verses few people fully listened to after enough wine. Dancers entertained crowds. Actors performed scenes from famous plays. Some hosts hired acrobats, comedians, or exotic performers from distant provinces simply to ensure guests never experienced even a moment of boredom. Ancient Roman elites feared silence the same way sailors feared storms. Conversation itself became competitive. Guests debated politics, philosophy, military campaigns, religion, literature, gossip, and scandals while carefully trying to appear intelligent without accidentally insulting someone powerful enough to destroy their career tomorrow morning. Roman dinner parties balanced constantly between elegance and disaster. One badly timed joke or drunken insult could transform an evening of luxury into lifelong political hostility. Gossip spread rapidly during banquets. Wealthy Romans exchanged rumors about affairs, corruption scandals, gambling debts, failed marriages, incompetent politicians, and embarrassing social disasters while pretending deep concern for morality. Entire reputations rose or collapsed between courses of roasted meat and honey pastries. Elite Roman society operated like an enormous dramatic machine powered almost entirely by wine and judgment. Servants worked constantly behind the scenes carrying dishes, cleaning spills, pouring drinks, preparing baths, managing fires, and quietly enduring the chaos surrounding them. Large banquets required enormous labor from enslaved workers who made elite luxury possible while remaining nearly invisible to the guests themselves. Roman wealth depended heavily upon this hidden system of constant service and exploitation. Some hosts became infamous for outrageous extravagance. Roman historians describe banquets featuring fountains flowing with wine, ceilings designed to shower flower petals onto guests, golden dishes, exotic animals displayed for entertainment, and meals so expensive they could have supported entire families for years. One emperor supposedly served dishes shaped like mythical creatures while another reportedly spent fortunes importing rare fish purely for dramatic effect. Rome occasionally crossed the line between sophistication and performance art created by deeply bored millionaires. But beneath all the luxury, banquets served an important social purpose. Rome's elite class depended heavily on networking, alliances, reputation, and public visibility. Dinner parties strengthened relationships, displayed power, rewarded loyalty, and reminded everyone exactly who possessed wealth important enough to host unforgettable evenings. Politics and entertainment blended together constantly in Roman society. And for guests, these banquets offered escape from daily anxieties through food, wine, spectacle, and conversation. Rome remained crowded, competitive, dangerous, and politically unstable even for the wealthy. Lavish dinners created temporary worlds of comfort and excess where powerful citizens could forget the empire's endless problems for a few hours while arguing dramatically about poetry beside silver bowls filled with imported oysters. As the night stretched deeper into darkness, conversations slurred, musicians played softer melodies, exhausted servants cleared mountains of dishes, and drunken aristocrats slowly stumbled home through torchlit Roman streets carrying leftover food, political gossip, wine stains, emotional regrets, and the firm belief that tomorrow night's banquet might somehow be even more excessive than this one. Listening to poetry readings and storytelling in ancient Rome was one of the few activities where citizens willingly gathered together for hours just to hear another human being speak dramatically about love, war, betrayal, gods, politics, heartbreak, or occasionally a very expensive fish. Romans absolutely adored spoken entertainment. In a world without television, podcasts, or social media, a talented storyteller could attract crowds powerful enough to silence entire courtyards. A terrible storyteller, unfortunately, could also attract crowds mostly because escaping politely was socially impossible. As evening settled over the city, wealthy Romans hosted gatherings inside candlelit villas while ordinary citizens packed into taverns, bathhouses, courtyards, and public squares searching for conversation, entertainment, gossip, and distraction from another exhausting day inside the loudest empire on earth. And somewhere in nearly every gathering, one overly confident Roman inevitably cleared his throat dramatically, raised a scroll into the air, and prepared to read poetry at a volume suggesting the gods themselves had personally requested tonight's performance. Romans treated poetry as serious social currency. A skilled poet could gain fame, wealthy patrons, political influence, romantic attention, and invitations into elite circles. Meanwhile, unsuccessful poets usually gained exhausted audiences silently wondering how many more verses remained before wine became an acceptable escape strategy. Public readings became hugely popular throughout Roman society. Poets performed epic stories about legendary heroes, tragic romances, military victories, jealous gods, doomed lovers, and emotional suffering described in language so dramatic it could make ordering bread sound spiritually devastating. Crowds listened carefully, applauded loudly, and occasionally pretended to understand complicated philosophical verses entirely because nobody wanted to appear unintelligent in front of wealthy guests holding wine cups. Storytelling carried enormous importance in Roman culture because stories connected people together. News traveled through stories. Politics spread through stories. Scandals survived through stories. Heroes became immortal through stories. Even ordinary Romans escaping daily boredom after work gathered eagerly to hear travelers, actors, musicians, philosophers, and wandering storytellers transform crowded rooms into worlds filled with adventure, tragedy, comedy, and glorious exaggeration. And honestly, after spending an entire day navigating crowded Roman streets filled with noise, smoke, arguments, tax collectors, and collapsing apartment buildings, sitting beneath warm torchlight while someone recited dramatic poetry beside flowing wine probably sounded like a pretty excellent evening. Playing board games and dice games with friends in ancient Rome was one of the empire's most dangerous forms of relaxation, because Romans somehow managed to transform simple entertainment into loud emotional warfare fueled by gambling, pride, wine, and accusations of cheating dramatic enough to destroy lifelong friendships over tiny carved cubes. As evening settled across Rome, the city's endless noise shifted from busy markets and crowded streets into taverns, courtyards, bathhouses, military camps, and candlelit homes where Romans gathered around wooden tables searching for distraction after another exhausting day inside the world's largest empire. Some came to drink. Some came to gossip. Others came specifically to gamble away money they absolutely could not afford to lose while confidently claiming luck was finally turning around tonight. And everywhere across the city, dice began clattering against wooden boards like tiny warning signs from the gods themselves. Romans loved games almost obsessively. Rich citizens played elaborate strategy games using carved pieces made from ivory, glass, stone, or polished wood. Poorer Romans scratched game boards directly into benches, walls, and pavement so they could play practically anywhere. Archaeologists have even discovered game boards carved into public buildings, proving Roman citizens apparently struggled to survive even short periods without competition, arguments, or opportunities for reckless betting. The most common games involved dice. Small cubes rolled endlessly across tavern tables while players shouted in triumph, cursed fortune itself, accused each other of cheating, and promised this next throw would definitely recover all previous losses. Human beings, remarkably, have not evolved emotionally at all in 2,000 years. Roman soldiers gambled inside military camps after brutal days of marching and training. Merchants played during long business evenings. Wealthy aristocrats hosted elegant gaming parties while pretending their gambling habits reflected intellectual sophistication instead of deeply concerning impulse control. Even emperors became obsessed with dice games. One Roman emperor reportedly carried gaming equipment everywhere he traveled because apparently conquering nations still left enough free time for aggressively losing money in moving carriages. And naturally, cheating was everywhere. Loaded dice became so common that Roman writers complained constantly about dishonest gamblers using weighted cubes, sleight of hand, hidden tricks, and suspiciously miraculous luck. Certain taverns gained reputations for attracting professional gamblers who targeted drunk customers with the emotional vulnerability of starving wolves spotting confused sheep. Arguments exploded constantly around gaming tables. A single bad throw could transform relaxed conversation into screaming accusations within seconds. Friendships collapsed over disputed results. Wine cups shattered during fights. Some Romans became so emotionally invested in games that losing gracefully simply stopped existing as a concept entirely. But despite the chaos, games served an important purpose in Roman society. Rome was crowded, stressful, exhausting, and deeply unequal. Games offered temporary escape from work, politics, debt, family pressure, military service, and the endless struggle of surviving urban life. Around gaming tables, citizens laughed together, argued together, drank together, and briefly forgot how overwhelming the empire itself could feel outside tavern walls. And perhaps that explains why Romans kept returning night after night to noisy rooms filled with rolling dice, flickering oil lamps, spilled wine, dangerous bets, and men loudly insisting the gods were personally sabotaging them during board games. Because sometimes after surviving another exhausting day in ancient Rome, all people truly wanted was a table, a few friends, terrible luck, and one final chance to win everything back before going home emotionally destroyed but somehow still optimistic enough to try again tomorrow night. Watching street performers, musicians, and dancers in ancient Rome was one of the easiest ways for ordinary citizens to escape boredom without spending enormous amounts of money, although Romans still somehow managed to turn simple public entertainment into loud emotional chaos filled with applause, gambling, drunken singing, and occasional arguments dramatic enough to attract even larger crowds. As the heat of the afternoon slowly faded and Rome's busy streets filled with evening movement, performers emerged across the city transforming marketplaces, public squares, alleyways, taverns, bathhouse entrances, and crowded intersections into living stages. The empire never truly became quiet. Somewhere in Rome, somebody was always shouting, singing, dancing, arguing, playing music, or attempting to balance dangerously on top of something unstable for public attention. Street entertainment existed everywhere because Roman cities overflowed constantly with people searching for distraction after exhausting days of work. Laborers left construction sites covered in dust. Merchants closed noisy market stalls. Soldiers wandered through crowded streets looking for wine and excitement. Wealthy citizens traveled with servants through the city while trying very hard to appear unbothered by the enormous human chaos surrounding them. And waiting for all of them were performers. Musicians played flutes, lyres, drums, horns, and stringed instruments while crowds gathered nearby listening, talking, drinking, or pretending they understood complicated songs about mythology and heartbreak. Some musicians became genuinely respected artists. Others simply played loud enough to collect coins from exhausted citizens too tired to argue. Dancers performed in public squares wearing colorful clothing while moving dramatically to music echoing between stone buildings. Some performances were elegant and carefully practiced. Others looked dangerously close to improvised disaster but remained entertaining anyway because Roman crowds appreciated confidence almost as much as talent. Acrobats flipped through crowded streets. Jugglers balanced objects before cheering audiences. Comedians mocked politicians, wealthy citizens, bad marriages, corrupt officials, and everyday Roman frustrations while audiences laughed loudly at jokes they absolutely would deny repeating if questioned later by authorities. Storytellers attracted enormous gatherings by reciting myths, military victories, tragic romances, heroic adventures, or wildly exaggerated rumors disguised as factual news. Romans loved dramatic storytelling so much that crowds sometimes stood listening for hours while performers described legendary battles or scandalous affairs with the emotional intensity of men personally present during every event. Accuracy became less important than entertainment remarkably quickly. And naturally, music and performances often blended directly into drinking and gambling. Taverns hired musicians to attract customers. Crowds placed bets on dancers, performers, or competitive entertainers. Drunk Romans sang loudly alongside street musicians despite possessing absolutely none of the musical ability their confidence suggested otherwise. Entire evenings disappeared beneath music, shouting, laughter, clapping, and terrible singing echoing through Roman streets long after sunset. Wealthier Romans sometimes hired private entertainers for banquets and parties. Musicians played softly during luxurious dinners while dancers performed for aristocratic guests reclining on expensive couches pretending their civilization represented the peak of refined culture despite spending half the evening watching jugglers beside wine fountains. Street performers also became important sources of news and satire. Since large numbers of Romans could not easily access official political discussions, entertainers spread information through jokes, songs, stories, and public performances. Clever comedians mocked corruption carefully enough to avoid punishment while still allowing audiences to laugh at powerful people safely disguised beneath humor. Rome often tolerated criticism more easily when accompanied by music and dramatic hand gestures. For ordinary citizens, public entertainment offered escape from the exhausting realities of Roman urban life. Rome was crowded, noisy, unequal, stressful, and often dangerous. Apartments were cramped. Streets smelled terrible during summer heat. Work remained physically exhausting for most citizens. But for a few hours in the evening, music and performance transformed ordinary streets into places filled with excitement, laughter, rhythm, storytelling, and shared human energy. Children watched performers with amazement while adults gathered nearby drinking wine and debating whether certain musicians were brilliant artists or simply extremely loud. Travelers stopped to listen beside fountains. Merchants delayed going home. Crowds formed and dissolved constantly as new acts appeared throughout the city. And perhaps most importantly, street performers cured boredom, Rome's unofficial national enemy. Ancient Romans feared silence almost instinctively. Life needed noise, spectacle, conversation, movement, and emotion at all times. Public entertainment filled the city with constant stimulation while reminding citizens that even after exhausting days of labor and stress, there would always be another song, another dance, another joke, another performance, and another crowd gathering beneath flickering torchlight somewhere in the endless restless heart of Rome. Temples stood everywhere across Rome. Massive marble structures towered over crowded streets while smaller shrines appeared beside homes, marketplaces, fountains, workshops, military camps, and even dangerous crossroads where Romans apparently felt extra nervous about divine protection. To Romans, the gods were not distant spiritual ideas floating peacefully above humanity. The gods were active, emotional, unpredictable forces constantly interfering with daily life like invisible landlords demanding attention at all hours. A Roman citizen might visit a temple for dozens of different reasons. A merchant prayed for profitable business. A soldier prayed before battle. A mother prayed for her children. A gambler prayed before rolling dice despite overwhelming evidence the gods had stopped helping him several terrible decisions ago. Everyone wanted something. Good harvests. Healthy families. Safe journeys. Political success. Romantic luck. Financial recovery. Fewer diseases. Better weather. Less public embarrassment. And naturally, Romans believed maintaining good relationships with the gods required endless rituals. Temple ceremonies filled the city with movement, smoke, chanting, music, and crowds carrying offerings through streets lined with statues and burning incense. Priests performed complicated rituals with extreme seriousness because even tiny mistakes supposedly risked offending divine powers capable of punishing entire communities. Roman religion operated less like peaceful meditation and more like cosmic customer service performed under enormous pressure. Animal sacrifices became one of the most important rituals. Bulls, sheep, pigs, goats, and birds were offered to the gods during public ceremonies while priests carefully observed every detail searching for signs of divine approval. Romans believed the gods communicated through strange omens hidden inside nature itself. The behavior of animals, patterns of lightning, flights of birds, unusual weather, or even the condition of internal organs after sacrifices could reveal whether the gods felt pleased, angry, or deeply disappointed in humanity once again. Which meant somewhere in ancient Rome, an exhausted priest was absolutely staring into the liver of a sacrificed sheep trying to interpret divine messages while surrounded by nervous politicians pretending they completely understood what was happening. Public festivals transformed religion into enormous social events. Crowds packed temples during celebrations honoring Jupiter, Mars, Venus, Saturn, and countless other gods connected to Roman life. Music echoed through the streets while citizens wore flower garlands, shared meals, drank wine, watched processions, and temporarily escaped daily routines through collective celebration. Rome rarely separated entertainment from religion. If people gathered together long enough, eventually there would be music, food, gambling, arguments, and somebody dramatically overreacting in public. Temples also functioned as important social spaces. Citizens met friends there, exchanged gossip, listened to public announcements, discussed politics, and watched ceremonies partly out of devotion and partly because there was always something interesting happening nearby. Wealthy Romans donated statues, funded temples, or sponsored religious festivals to gain popularity and public admiration. Politics and religion remained tightly connected because Roman society treated nearly every public activity as an opportunity for status and influence. Even emperors participated heavily in religious rituals. Successful rulers presented themselves as protectors chosen or favored by the gods. Public ceremonies reinforced imperial power while reminding citizens that Rome's victories supposedly carried divine approval. Nothing strengthened political authority quite like convincing millions of people the heavens themselves supported your government. Ordinary Romans carried religion into daily life constantly. Families kept household shrines honoring protective spirits inside their homes. Travelers prayed before journeys. Soldiers carried protective charms. Citizens visited temples before major decisions hoping the gods might provide signs or at minimum avoid actively sabotaging them. Superstition blended naturally into everyday Roman existence because life inside the empire felt unpredictable enough already without adding angry gods into the situation. And perhaps most importantly, temples offered emotional comfort. Rome was crowded, stressful, dangerous, and uncertain. Disease spread easily. Fires destroyed neighborhoods. Political instability appeared constantly. War touched nearly every generation. Religion gave Roman structure, meaning, routine, and the reassuring belief that powerful divine beings might still be listening if prayers were loud enough and sacrifices expensive enough. Of course, Romans also feared getting rituals wrong. Saying incorrect words, performing ceremonies improperly, or forgetting important offerings supposedly risked terrible bad luck. Roman religion demanded precision. Priests sometimes repeated entire ceremonies simply because someone sneezed at the wrong moment or a sacred chicken behaved suspiciously during an important ritual. Ancient Rome truly believed the universe itself might collapse because a bird looked emotionally uncooperative during a ceremony. And yet despite all the fear, pressure, smoke, sacrifices, and endless rituals, temple life remained deeply woven into Roman society because it gave people something powerful: hope. Hope for protection. Hope for luck. Hope for victory. Hope for survival. Hope that somewhere above the noise and chaos of the empire, the gods might still care enough to listen to ordinary human beings struggling through another exhausting day beneath the shadow of Rome. If ancient Romans had free time, there was a very high chance they ended up wandering through crowded markets doing absolutely nothing productive for several hours while somehow still spending money they absolutely needed for rent, wine, or bread later that week. Roman markets were not quiet shopping areas where polite citizens calmly compared prices before making responsible financial decisions. They were gigantic centers of noise, gossip, entertainment, arguments, strange smells, exotic goods, wandering animals, and pure unstoppable human chaos. From sunrise until evening, the streets around the markets overflowed with activity. Merchants shouted constantly over one another trying to attract customers. Fish sellers waved fresh catches through the air while loudly claiming everything was caught this morning, even when the smell suggested the fish had personally witnessed the fall of several civilizations already. Bakers filled the streets with the smell of warm bread while nearby butchers hacked meat apart beside screaming customers arguing over prices loud enough to alert nearby provinces. And Romans absolutely loved it. People visited markets even when they did not need to buy anything. Crowded markets gave citizens entertainment, movement, conversation, and escape from cramped apartments and exhausting work routines. Rome was loud everywhere, but markets concentrated that noise into one glorious overwhelming experience where every street corner offered something new to see, hear, smell, or regret purchasing 5 minutes later. Traveling merchants arrived from across the empire bringing exotic spices, fabrics, perfumes, jewelry, animals, pottery, oils, and strange imported objects ordinary Romans had never seen before. Citizens gathered around stalls just to stare at goods from distant lands while sellers exaggerated wildly about where everything came from. According to Roman merchants, every ordinary object somehow possessed a fascinating dramatic backstory involving dangerous journeys, pirates, deserts, or mysterious eastern kingdoms. Street performers wandered through the crowds entertaining bored shoppers with music, juggling, dancing, comedy, storytelling, and acrobatics. Musicians played flutes and drums while children followed performers through busy streets. Fortune tellers promised to reveal the future for a few coins. Pickpockets quietly viewed the entire market as a full-time career opportunity generously provided by distracted citizens carrying money purses. Markets also became giant social centers. Friends met there. Families wandered together. Neighbors exchanged gossip while pretending to browse vegetables. Political arguments erupted beside bread stalls. Merchants spread rumors faster than official announcements ever could. By midday, a single story about an emperor, senator, gladiator, or scandalous affair could spread across entire neighborhoods purely through market conversations. And naturally, bargaining became its own form of public entertainment. Romans rarely accepted first prices peacefully. Customers argued dramatically with merchants over coins while nearby crowds watched the performance almost like theater. Some negotiations lasted longer than the actual value of the item itself. Roman citizens would absolutely spend 30 exhausting minutes fighting to save 3 coins out of pure emotional principle. The markets also reflected Rome's incredible diversity. Travelers from distant provinces mixed with local citizens while dozens of languages echoed through crowded streets. Soldiers wandered beside wealthy aristocrats. Slaves carried goods through packed alleys while laborers unloaded carts beside philosophers debating morality loud enough for absolutely nobody to enjoy peacefully. And perhaps most importantly, Roman markets cured boredom. Ancient Romans feared silence almost instinctively. Life needed movement, conversation, spectacle, noise, and human interaction at all times. Markets delivered endless stimulation through crowds, performances, arguments, food smells, gossip, shopping, music, and the comforting realization that somewhere nearby another Roman citizen was currently making even worse financial decisions than you were. For wealthy Romans, owning exotic animals became one of the ultimate status symbols because apparently massive villas, expensive wine, marble statues, and private servants still were not enough to satisfy elite Roman levels of showing off. Ordinary citizens kept simple pets like dogs or cats. Rich Romans looked at ordinary pets and decided what they really needed was a brightly colored parrot from India, a monkey from Africa, or a peacock dramatic enough to emotionally dominate an entire garden party. Ancient Rome became obsessed with rare creatures imported from distant parts of the empire. The stranger, louder, larger, or more difficult an animal was to transport across continents, the more Roman aristocrats desperately wanted it wandering around their homes. Wealthy villas slowly transformed into miniature private zoos. Peacocks strutted through gardens like arrogant emperors. Exotic birds screeched from golden cages. Monkeys climbed furniture while guests pretended this was perfectly normal elite behavior. Some Romans even kept snakes, gazelles, wild cats, or tiny imported deer simply because owning unusual animals proved they possessed enough wealth to waste enormous amounts of money on creatures with absolutely no practical purpose whatsoever. And naturally, these animals became part of Roman social life. Guests visiting wealthy homes expected entertainment, and nothing impressed dinner parties quite like casually revealing a rare animal from a distant conquered province while servants poured wine nearby. Roman elites treated exotic pets almost like living decorations designed specifically to make visitors jealous. Parrots became especially popular among rich Romans because they could imitate human speech. Wealthy citizens spent absurd amounts of money teaching birds to repeat greetings, names, or dramatic phrases purely for amusement. Somewhere in ancient Rome, there was absolutely a rich man forcing exhausted dinner guests to listen to his expensive bird repeat insults for 2 straight hours while everyone politely pretended this counted as sophisticated entertainment. Peacocks also became major symbols of luxury and status. Romans admired their colorful feathers and dramatic appearance so much that wealthy families displayed them proudly inside gardens and courtyards. Unfortunately, peacocks are also extremely loud creatures capable of sounding like haunted spirits screaming into the night, meaning many elite Roman neighborhoods were probably far less peaceful than the marble statues suggested. Some aristocrats became obsessed with exotic fish as well. Large decorative fish ponds appeared inside luxurious villas where rare fish were carefully fed, displayed, and admired like underwater treasures. Certain Roman elites reportedly grew emotionally attached to expensive fish while servants maintained elaborate pools more luxurious than homes belonging to ordinary citizens. Roman historians openly mocked this behavior because even by Roman standards, becoming emotionally invested in millionaire fish collections felt slightly excessive. Of course, not every exotic animal remained a harmless pet. Some wealthy Romans owned dangerous creatures partly because danger itself impressed people. Lions, leopards, bears, and other wild animals imported for gladiator games or public spectacles occasionally appeared in private collections belonging to emperors or extremely wealthy citizens with remarkably poor ideas about household safety. Transporting exotic animals across the empire required enormous effort. Traders moved creatures through deserts, across oceans, and along Roman roads stretching thousands of miles. Many animals never survived the journey, making successful imports even more valuable and expensive. Roman elites loved anything rare partly because rarity itself became proof of power. If an animal existed somewhere in the empire, eventually some rich Roman would attempt to own it. And beneath all the extravagance, exotic animals represented something deeper about Roman society. Rome conquered enormous territories filled with unfamiliar cultures, landscapes, and wildlife. Bringing rare animals back to the capital symbolized imperial power itself. Exotic creatures became living trophies demonstrating how far Roman influence stretched across the known world. But for ordinary citizens visiting markets, festivals, or wealthy estates, these animals also provided entertainment and wonder. Most Romans would never travel beyond Italy, so seeing colorful birds, strange monkeys, or giant imported beasts offered glimpses into distant lands they could barely imagine. And perhaps most importantly, exotic pets cured boredom, which Romans considered a serious enemy of civilized life. In an empire obsessed with spectacle, status, and endless entertainment, even animals became part of the performance. Because in ancient Rome, owning a normal pet simply was not enough if you could instead own something capable of terrifying neighbors, impressing dinner guests, and screaming loudly enough to wake half the street before sunrise. Joining public festivals and holiday celebrations in ancient Rome was one of the few times the entire empire collectively decided normal rules no longer mattered and everybody should simply eat, drink, shout, gamble, dance, and create as much public chaos as humanly possible in the name of tradition. Romans absolutely loved festivals. In fact, the Roman calendar became so overloaded with holidays, religious celebrations, games, ceremonies, and public events that many citizens probably spent half the year emotionally preparing for the next excuse to stop working. Some festivals honored gods. Others celebrated military victories, harvests, emperors, seasonal changes, or religious traditions. But almost all of them eventually turned into enormous citywide parties overflowing with crowds, noise, food, music, drinking, and public spectacle. When a major festival arrived, Rome transformed completely. Streets filled with decorations, flower garlands, burning incense, musicians, vendors, priests, performers, and endless crowds moving through the city like human rivers. Temples overflowed with ceremonies while nearby taverns overflowed with citizens already several cups of wine ahead of responsible decision-making. And the atmosphere was electric. For ordinary Romans trapped most days inside exhausting routines, crowded apartments, and endless work, festivals offered escape. Laborers left workshops. Merchants closed stalls. Soldiers relaxed from military discipline. Even politicians temporarily pretended to be cheerful human beings capable of enjoying themselves in public. One of the most famous Roman festivals was Saturnalia, a chaotic winter celebration honoring the god Saturn. During Saturnalia, social order itself temporarily loosened. Gambling became openly accepted. Gifts were exchanged. Massive feasts filled homes and streets. Decorations covered buildings. People wore colorful clothing and shouted greetings everywhere they went. Masters sometimes served food to slaves as part of the celebration, though Romans somehow managed to treat temporary kindness like an absolutely revolutionary concept. Public banquets became central parts of many festivals. Huge crowds gathered around food stalls eating bread, roasted meat, olives, pastries, nuts, fruit, and whatever else vendors could prepare fast enough for thousands of hungry citizens. Wine flowed endlessly through the city while musicians played loudly enough to shake entire streets. And naturally, entertainment appeared everywhere. Actors performed plays in public theaters. Street performers danced through crowded squares. Musicians played flutes, drums, and lyres while drunk crowds attempted singing with emotional confidence greatly exceeding musical ability. Chariot races filled the Circus Maximus with screaming fans waving faction colors while gladiator games attracted enormous audiences hungry for excitement and spectacle. Roman festivals were loud. Extremely loud. Quiet reflection rarely survived long once thousands of excited citizens filled the streets carrying wine cups and gambling money. Public arguments erupted constantly. Friends reunited dramatically. Strangers danced together. Merchants sold overpriced festival goods while children ran wildly through crowds fueled entirely by sugar, excitement, and complete absence of supervision. Religious rituals remained important parts of these celebrations too. Priests led sacrifices and ceremonies inside temples while citizens prayed for luck, health, successful harvests, military victories, and divine protection. Smoke from sacrifices drifted above packed streets while crowds gathered nearby partly from devotion and partly because large public ceremonies always promised something entertaining might happen eventually. Wealthy Romans hosted extravagant private parties during festivals while ordinary citizens celebrated publicly in streets, taverns, and marketplaces. But festivals temporarily blurred certain social boundaries. Rich and poor crowded together during games, processions, performances, and public celebrations. For a few days, Rome felt united beneath shared excitement, noise, and collective emotional chaos. Of course, Roman authorities also understood festivals served political purposes. Keeping enormous populations entertained reduced unrest and strengthened loyalty toward the empire. Public celebrations reminded citizens of Rome's power, wealth, religion, and military success while distracting them from taxes, overcrowding, corruption, or the terrifying possibility their apartment building might collapse next week. And perhaps most importantly, festivals cured boredom, the ancient Roman condition feared almost as seriously as invasion or financial ruin. Romans believed life should feel alive at all times, filled with spectacle, movement, music, conversation, celebration, and enormous crowds packed into public spaces shouting happily beneath torchlight. As night fell during Roman festivals, the city glowed beneath fires, lamps, and endless noise echoing through marble streets. Music continued long after sunset. Taverns remained packed. Crowds wandered through celebrations laughing, arguing, singing, gambling, dancing, and delaying sleep as long as possible because somewhere nearby another performance, feast, race, or spectacle was still happening. And deep inside the restless heart of Rome, surrounded by wine fumes, cheering crowds, flickering torches, and the sound of thousands of citizens celebrating together beneath the night sky, boredom never stood a chance. Relaxing in the gardens and courtyards of Roman villas was one of the few moments wealthy Romans could temporarily escape the noise, crowds, and chaos of city life while pretending their empire was not constantly collapsing into arguments, political drama, and public shouting competitions. Behind the walls of luxurious villas, elegant gardens bloomed with fountains, statues, flowers, olive trees, and shaded walkways where rich Romans spent long afternoons drinking wine, talking philosophy, listening to music, or doing absolutely nothing productive whatsoever. Servants moved quietly through marble courtyards carrying fruit, bread, perfumes, and cool drinks while water trickled softly from decorative fountains into stone pools filled with fish. Birds sang from garden trees while warm sunlight spilled across carefully designed pathways lined with roses and climbing vines. For wealthy citizens, these private gardens offered peace rarely found in the crowded streets of Rome. Outside the villa walls, the city overflowed with merchants shouting, carts rattling across stone roads, barking dogs, political speeches, gambling arguments, and endless public noise. Inside the gardens, however, life slowed down. Roman elites reclined on cushioned benches discussing poetry, politics, philosophy, military victories, or gossip about rivals while servants fanned away the summer heat. Some read scrolls quietly beneath shaded columns. Others hosted small gatherings with musicians and close friends while wine flowed gently through the evening. Gardens also became symbols of wealth and sophistication. The larger and more beautiful a villa garden appeared, the more power and status its owner displayed to guests. Exotic plants, imported statues, decorative pools, and rare animals transformed these spaces into private worlds designed to impress visitors while giving Romans a temporary escape from the exhausting energy of the empire itself. And perhaps for a little while, surrounded by cool fountains, soft wind, flowering trees, and the fading sound of distant Roman streets, even the busiest aristocrats could finally breathe slowly and forget about politics, debts, wars, and public chaos until tomorrow morning arrived once again. Watching theatrical plays and comedies in ancient Rome was one of the empire's favorite ways to relax after work, because apparently Romans believed the perfect evening involved loud crowds, dramatic actors, rude jokes, exaggerated emotions, political satire, and somebody wearing an absurd costume while shouting across a massive outdoor theater. Roman theaters filled constantly with citizens searching for entertainment after long exhausting days inside crowded cities and noisy streets. Laborers, merchants, soldiers, aristocrats, travelers, and ordinary families gathered together beneath enormous stone amphitheaters where performances transformed entire afternoons into spectacles of laughter, chaos, romance, betrayal, and public embarrassment. And Romans absolutely loved comedy. Comic plays became wildly popular because they mocked everyday life in ways audiences immediately understood. Actors joked about greedy merchants, lazy servants, arrogant rich men, foolish husbands, dishonest politicians, strict fathers, and young lovers making terrible decisions while crowds roared with laughter loud enough to echo through the city itself. The performances were energetic, exaggerated, and intentionally dramatic. Actors wore colorful costumes and expressive masks while shouting lines clearly enough for thousands of spectators to hear. Nothing about Roman theater was subtle. Emotional reactions needed to reach the very back rows where exhausted citizens sat eating bread and loudly commenting on the play as if the actors could not hear them. Music often accompanied performances with drums, flutes, and instruments adding rhythm and excitement to the stories. Some plays included dancing, singing, slapstick humor, chase scenes, and chaotic misunderstandings complicated enough to emotionally exhaust everyone involved before finally resolving at the last possible moment. Crowds reacted constantly during performances. Romans did not sit silently appreciating theater with respectful quiet attention. They cheered favorite actors, laughed loudly at jokes, insulted bad performances, argued about scenes, threw comments toward the stage, and occasionally caused enough noise to make the entire experience feel closer to a sporting event than polite dramatic art. Wealthy citizens attended theater partly for entertainment and partly to be seen publicly enjoying culture like sophisticated intellectuals. Ordinary Romans attended because plays offered escape from work, stress, debt, politics, and the exhausting realities of daily life. For a few hours, everyone could laugh together at exaggerated versions of the same human problems they dealt with outside the theater walls every single day. Some playwrights also slipped political criticism and satire into performances carefully enough to avoid punishment while still entertaining crowds hungry to laugh at authority figures. Humor became one of Rome's safest ways to criticize powerful people without directly starting riots, although Roman audiences occasionally seemed willing to attempt both simultaneously. And perhaps most importantly, theater cured boredom. Ancient Romans feared dullness almost professionally. Life needed movement, noise, spectacle, jokes, music, arguments, and emotional chaos. The theater delivered all of it beneath warm sunlight and roaring crowds while actors shouted dramatic lines across stages decorated with painted scenery and elaborate costumes. As evening approached and performances finally ended, spectators spilled back into Roman streets laughing about favorite scenes, repeating jokes badly, debating actors, and carrying the energy of the theater into taverns, markets, bathhouses, and homes across the city. Because in ancient Rome, entertainment was never just something people watched quietly. It was something they lived together loudly. Flirting and socializing at public gatherings in ancient Rome was basically a giant empire-wide competition where thousands of citizens dressed nicely, drank too much wine, exchanged dramatic compliments, spread dangerous gossip, and attempted to look attractive while sweating aggressively beneath the Mediterranean heat. Romans turned nearly every public event into a social opportunity. Festivals, banquets, bathhouses, theaters, temples, chariot races, markets, and public gardens all became crowded stages where people talked, laughed, argued, showed off expensive clothing, and searched for romance with the subtlety of marching armies. If two Romans stood near each other longer than 5 minutes during a public celebration, there was a very high chance somebody nearby immediately assumed a scandal was developing. Wealthy aristocrats arrived at gatherings surrounded by servants, perfumes, jewelry, and carefully arranged outfits designed to scream, "I am incredibly important and emotionally unavailable." Meanwhile, ordinary citizens flirted through jokes, compliments, music, dancing, shared drinks, and long conversations beneath torchlit streets overflowing with noise and excitement. And naturally, gossip spread faster than wildfire. One conversation at a banquet could become citywide news by sunrise. Romans absolutely loved discussing relationships, affairs, marriages, breakups, jealous rivals, and embarrassing romantic disasters. Entire reputations could rise or collapse during one dramatic evening filled with wine and poor decisions. Public festivals became especially chaotic. Music echoed through crowded streets while dancers performed beside overflowing taverns and cheering crowds. Young Romans wandered through celebrations laughing with friends, exchanging playful insults, sharing food, and trying very hard to appear confident while internally panicking like every generation of humans throughout history. The bathhouses also became enormous social spaces. Men and women visited separate bathing areas at different times, but conversations, flirting, gossip, and public networking surrounded bath culture constantly. Romans discussed politics, business, sports, relationships, and scandals while relaxing in steaming pools crowded with half the city. Ancient Rome somehow managed to combine personal hygiene with emotional chaos on a truly impressive scale. Theaters and gladiator games offered more opportunities for socializing. Crowds packed tightly together while spectators laughed, cheered, argued, and loudly reacted to performances. Friends introduced friends. Wealthy families arranged meetings. Young aristocrats showed off education and humor while pretending they were not desperately trying to impress everyone around them. Roman poetry also played a huge role in romance and social life. Love poems circulated through elite society while dramatic writers described heartbreak, jealousy, beauty, obsession, and emotional suffering with enough intensity to make modern relationship drama look emotionally relaxed. Somewhere in Rome, there was always at least one poet ruining his own mental stability because somebody smiled at him briefly during a dinner party. And despite Rome's strict social hierarchy, public gatherings occasionally blurred social boundaries. Rich and poor mixed during festivals, races, markets, and celebrations more closely than usual. Shared entertainment brought enormous crowds together beneath music, torchlight, food stalls, performances, and endless conversation flowing through the streets late into the night. Of course, Roman relationships also involved constant social pressure. Families cared deeply about status, reputation, marriage alliances, and public image. A badly handled romance could create scandal powerful enough to damage careers, friendships, or political ambitions. Which only made public flirting even more exciting for people already bored with ordinary daily life. And perhaps that was the real reason Romans loved social gatherings so much. In a crowded empire obsessed with spectacle, power, beauty, gossip, and public reputation, social life itself became entertainment. Every festival, banquet, theater show, or market visit carried the possibility of meeting someone fascinating, embarrassing yourself publicly, hearing unbelievable rumors, or accidentally becoming tomorrow morning's most discussed scandal. Which, judging by Roman history, happened constantly. In ancient Rome, political speeches were not calm intellectual discussions between reasonable adults. They were giant public performances where ambitious men in expensive togas stood in crowded forums yelling dramatic promises while thousands of citizens screamed back like spectators at a gladiator arena. Romans treated politics as entertainment with consequences. Public debates attracted enormous crowds because people genuinely loved the chaos. Citizens packed into the forum to watch senators insult rivals, generals boast about victories, philosophers argue about morality, and politicians confidently explain why every disaster in Rome was definitely somebody else's fault. And the louder the speaker became, the more the crowd loved it. Drinking wine during long evening gatherings in ancient Rome was one of the empire's favorite ways to relax after exhausting days filled with work, noise, crowds, and endless public chaos. As the sun disappeared behind the rooftops of Rome, citizens gathered inside villas, taverns, courtyards, and candlelit dining rooms where wine, food, music, and conversation flowed late into the night. Wealthy Romans reclined on cushioned couches while servants carried bread, olives, roasted meat, fruit, and large cups of watered wine through crowded rooms glowing beneath oil lamps. And Romans absolutely loved talking. Friends debated politics, philosophy, poetry, military victories, sports, scandals, and gossip while musicians played softly in the background. Some guests recited dramatic poems. Others argued loudly about chariot races or gambling losses. And somewhere in nearly every Roman gathering, one man was definitely telling the exact same story for the fifth time while pretending nobody had heard it already. The wine itself became part of the entertainment. Romans mixed wine with water before drinking, but even watered wine could quickly turn calm conversations into emotional speeches, terrible singing, and public arguments dramatic enough to entertain the entire room. Wealthy hosts competed constantly to serve the finest wines imported from across the empire. Expensive cups, silver pitchers, and exotic foods showed guests exactly how rich and powerful the host wanted everyone to believe he was. Roman dinner parties often felt less like peaceful evenings and more like elegant competitions disguised beneath music and wine. But for ordinary Romans too, evening drinking offered something important: escape. After long days spent working inside crowded noisy cities, gathering with friends beneath torchlight to share wine, laughter, stories, and conversation helped people forget the pressures of Roman life for a few precious hours. And as the night grew deeper, music echoed through the rooms, wine cups emptied and refilled endlessly, conversations became louder and less intelligent, and Rome once again proved that 2,000 years ago, human beings already understood one timeless truth very clearly. If people are given enough wine and enough free time, absolutely ridiculous conversations will eventually happen. Watching public executions and strange spectacles in ancient Rome was one of the empire's darkest forms of entertainment, because Romans somehow turned punishment into massive public events filled with cheering crowds, food vendors, and dramatic performances beneath the blazing sun. Thousands of citizens gathered inside arenas and public squares to watch criminals face brutal punishments while officials used these spectacles to display the terrifying power of Rome itself. Some executions were staged like theatrical shows with costumes, animals, music, and dramatic scenes designed to shock the audience as much as possible. And Romans loved spectacle. Crowds shouted, argued, reacted loudly, and watched every moment with intense fascination while vendors sold wine and snacks nearby, creating an atmosphere disturbingly close to a festival. Exotic animals imported from distant lands also appeared in public arenas where citizens stared in amazement at creatures they had never seen before. Wealthy emperors constantly competed to organize bigger, stranger, and more unforgettable spectacles than previous rulers because in ancient Rome, entertainment was not supposed to feel peaceful or relaxing. It was supposed to overwhelm people completely. And for a civilization obsessed with power, drama, and public performance, nothing captured attention more effectively than a spectacle large enough to make the entire city stop and watch together. Decorating homes and showing off wealth to guests in ancient Rome was not simply about interior design. It was a full competitive sport where wealthy Romans spent enormous fortunes trying to convince visitors their lives were more successful, sophisticated, and emotionally impressive than everyone else in the empire. For rich Romans, a house was not just a place to live. It was a public performance made from marble, gold, expensive furniture, fountains, paintings, and enough decorative statues to make guests wonder whether they had entered a home or accidentally walked into a museum owned by someone with unlimited money and absolutely no restraint. The moment visitors entered a wealthy Roman villa, the showing off began immediately. Large entrance halls displayed polished marble floors, colorful wall paintings, intricate mosaics, elegant columns, and statues of gods, heroes, emperors, or ancestors carefully positioned to remind everyone exactly how important the family believed itself to be. And naturally, everything needed to look expensive. Wealthy Romans imported rare marble from distant provinces, decorated walls with detailed fresco paintings, filled rooms with silver dishes, carved furniture, perfumes, exotic plants, and decorative fountains flowing gently through private courtyards. Some homes even contained heated floors, indoor pools, libraries, fish ponds, and gardens filled with rare animals purely because ordinary luxury had stopped feeling emotionally satisfying centuries earlier. Dinner parties became the perfect opportunity to display wealth publicly. Guests reclined inside beautifully decorated dining rooms while servants carried fine wine, exotic food, and expensive tableware beneath flickering oil lamps. Wealthy hosts carefully watched visitors react to every decoration, painting, sculpture, and imported object scattered around the villa like physical proof of social superiority. Even household gardens became status symbols. Rich Romans filled courtyards with flowers, fountains, statues, shaded walkways, and rare plants designed to impress visitors before conversations even began. The larger and more beautiful the garden appeared, the more powerful and successful the owner seemed in Roman society. And of course, competition between wealthy families never truly stopped. If one aristocrat installed a beautiful fountain, another suddenly needed a larger fountain with imported marble and exotic fish swimming beneath it. Roman elites approached home decoration with the calm emotional balance of modern people upgrading phones they absolutely did not need. But beneath all the luxury, Roman homes also reflected something deeper about the empire itself. Rome was built around status, reputation, public image, and social competition. Wealth was meant to be seen openly. A beautiful home showed political influence, financial power, cultural sophistication, and social success all at once. Because in ancient Rome, impressing guests was not considered a small personal hobby. It was practically a national responsibility. Visiting friends and family for long conversations often turned ordinary Roman evenings into hours of storytelling, gossip, laughter, arguments, and endless discussion beneath the warm glow of oil lamps. As the busy streets slowly quieted after sunset, Romans gathered inside homes, courtyards, balconies, gardens, and small dining rooms where food, wine, and conversation flowed deep into the night. Some visits were carefully planned family gatherings. Others happened naturally when neighbors, relatives, or friends stopped by for a short visit that somehow lasted 4 exhausting hours and included 3 political debates, 2 arguments about horse racing, and at least one dramatic story nobody fully believed. Romans loved conversation almost professionally. The moment guests arrived, servants or family members brought bread, olives, fruit, cheese, and cups of watered wine while everyone settled into comfortable seats around low tables or open courtyards. Older relatives discussed politics and military news while younger guests exchanged gossip about marriages, scandals, friendships, and public drama spreading through the city faster than official announcements ever could. And naturally, gossip became the real entertainment of the evening. Entire reputations could be discussed during a single dinner. Wealthy aristocrats, corrupt politicians, cheating merchants, terrible marriages, gambling disasters, and embarrassing public moments all became subjects of endless conversation. Romans pretended to disapprove of scandal while simultaneously demanding every possible detail with tremendous emotional enthusiasm. Family gatherings also became places where stories survived. Parents described difficult years from the past. Grandparents exaggerated memories about wars, famous leaders, or impossible personal adventures that somehow became more dramatic every single time they were retold. Children listened nearby while adults laughed, interrupted, corrected details, and argued over whose version of events was actually true. Some evenings stayed calm and relaxing. Others slowly transformed into loud emotional debates about philosophy, religion, politics, poetry, or chariot racing factions. Romans argued passionately about almost everything. Even simple conversations could suddenly sound like courtroom battles between deeply offended philosophers holding wine cups. But despite the noise and chaos, these gatherings mattered deeply. Life inside Roman cities could feel exhausting, crowded, stressful, and unpredictable. Long conversations with friends and family offered comfort, connection, laughter, support, and temporary escape from the pressures of daily life. And as the night grew darker, oil lamps flickered softly across the room while conversations continued beside empty wine cups and scattered food plates. Outside, Rome still thundered with distant noise and movement. But inside these homes, surrounded by familiar voices and shared stories, people found something rare in the middle of such a restless empire. A chance to slow down, talk freely, and feel human together for a little while longer before another noisy Roman morning arrived once again. Listening to musicians during evening meals turned ordinary Roman dinners into long nights filled with wine, conversation, soft music, and the constant feeling that somebody nearby was becoming far too emotional after only 2 cups of watered wine. As sunset covered the city in golden light, wealthy villas and busy homes slowly filled with the sounds of clinking cups, quiet laughter, moving servants, and musicians preparing instruments beside glowing oil lamps. Romans rarely enjoyed silence during meals. Food needed music. Conversations needed rhythm. And dinner parties without entertainment felt painfully incomplete to people who treated boredom like a national emergency. Musicians played flutes, lyres, drums, and stringed instruments while guests reclined around low dining tables eating bread, olives, roasted meat, fruit, cheese, and sweet desserts covered with honey. Soft melodies echoed through decorated dining rooms while wine flowed endlessly between conversations about politics, poetry, scandals, philosophy, military victories, and deeply unnecessary arguments about horse racing factions. And naturally, the atmosphere changed as the evening continued. At the beginning of the meal, conversations stayed polite and controlled. Guests complimented the food, praised the host's beautiful home, and pretended everyone gathered there was civilized and emotionally stable. But as musicians continued playing and more wine cups emptied, discussions became louder, stories became more dramatic, and confidence levels rose far beyond reasonable human limits. Some wealthy Romans hired highly skilled professional musicians to impress guests during banquets. Beautiful performances created elegant relaxing atmospheres while servants moved quietly through the room carrying fresh dishes and pouring wine beneath flickering torchlight. A successful dinner party was not just about food. It was about creating an experience guests would remember and discuss long after the night ended. Ordinary Romans enjoyed music too, though in simpler settings. Families and friends gathered inside courtyards, taverns, or small homes where traveling musicians sometimes performed during evening meals. Even simple music transformed exhausting days into moments of warmth, comfort, and celebration. Songs often carried emotional stories about love, war, heartbreak, gods, heroes, or tragic romance. Some guests sang along badly after enough wine. Others sat quietly listening while music drifted through open courtyards into the warm Roman night. Somewhere nearby, at least one guest was absolutely attempting poetry nobody requested while musicians silently reconsidered their career choices. But beneath the entertainment, music served an important purpose. Rome was loud, crowded, stressful, and restless almost constantly. Evening meals filled with music allowed people to slow down, connect with others, laugh, tell stories, and briefly escape the endless noise of city life. And as the final cups of wine were poured and musicians played softer melodies deep into the night, conversations gradually faded into tired laughter beneath the glow of dying lamps while Rome itself continued humming endlessly beyond the villa walls. Spending hours at public fountains and crowded city squares was how many Romans passed time without spending much money, because if there was one thing Rome never lacked, it was noise, gossip, and large groups of people standing around discussing absolutely everything for far longer than necessary. From early morning until late evening, public squares overflowed with life. Merchants shouted from nearby stalls. Children ran through crowded streets. Travelers rested beside fountains after long journeys while politicians, philosophers, workers, gamblers, musicians, and bored citizens gathered together beneath statues and marble buildings searching for conversation, entertainment, or simply an excuse not to go home yet. The fountains themselves became natural meeting places. Fresh water constantly flowed through beautifully carved stone basins where Romans filled buckets, washed hands, cooled off during summer heat, and exchanged endless local gossip. Entire friendships, arguments, business deals, and rumors spread beside public fountains while citizens waited their turn for water. And naturally, everybody talked. Romans loved conversation almost as much as wine. Groups formed everywhere around the squares discussing politics, gladiator fights, chariot races, military victories, scandals, expensive food prices, terrible neighbors, and dramatic stories that somehow became more exaggerated every time someone repeated them. Street performers also filled the public spaces with entertainment. Musicians played lively songs while dancers, storytellers, comedians, and acrobats attracted crowds throughout the day. Some people stopped to watch performances. Others simply enjoyed sitting nearby listening to the noise and movement of the city around them. For ordinary Romans living inside cramped noisy apartments, public squares offered something valuable space. Open fountains, shaded courtyards, and busy gathering places allowed people to escape crowded homes and spend time outdoors surrounded by energy and human activity. Wealthy citizens passed through the squares too, often surrounded by servants and expensive clothing while pretending not to notice how many people were quietly judging them from nearby benches and fountain walls. Rome's public spaces mixed every level of society together in one loud, constantly moving environment. And as evening arrived, the atmosphere changed again. Oil lamps flickered beside fountains while cooler air drifted through the streets. Friends gathered after work. Families sat together talking beneath statues and columns. Travelers rested near the sound of flowing water while conversations echoed softly across the square deep into the night. Because sometimes Romans did not need giant spectacles, gladiator arenas, or lavish banquets to escape boredom. Sometimes all they needed was a crowded square, flowing water, familiar voices, and several uninterrupted hours to talk endlessly beneath the restless heart of Rome. Progress rarely announces itself. It arrives quietly, often disguised as something small, fragile, and easy to overlook. In this case, it began with a creature most people would never think twice about. A worm. Busy. Hidden. Chewing leaves. Somewhere in ancient China, long before the rise of the great imperial dynasties, humans discovered something extraordinary inside the humble silkworm cocoon. Inside that delicate casing was a continuous thread, fine, strong, and unlike anything the ancient world had ever seen. It didn't look like invention. It looked like nature making a mistake that humans were smart enough to exploit. What followed would reshape fashion, trade, politics, and entire civilizations. Because silk was not just cloth. It was status. It was power. It was obsession made visible. In early Chinese societies, silk production became more than a craft. It became guarded knowledge, passed carefully through generations and protected with unusual seriousness. Silkworms fed on mulberry leaves, spun cocoons, and those cocoons were carefully unwound into continuous threads. The process sounded simple, almost unimpressive, yet it required patience, skill, and an understanding of nature that most ancient societies never achieved. As silk production refined over centuries, it transformed into a state-supported industry. Entire regions specialized in sericulture. Artisans developed weaving techniques that produced fabric so smooth it seemed to catch light rather than reflect it. Clothing became something far beyond protection from weather. It became a language. In imperial courts, silk robes spoke before people did. Colors, embroidery patterns, and textures indicated rank, authority, and even cosmic alignment. Dragons symbolized imperial strength. Phoenixes represented renewal. Clouds and celestial motifs suggested harmony with the heavens. Clothing no longer simply covered the body. It declared position in the universe. As trade networks expanded during the Han period, silk began moving westward. It traveled along caravan routes crossing deserts, mountain passes, and oasis cities. No single merchant carried it all the way. Instead, it passed through countless hands, each adding cost, distance, and mystery. By the time it reached foreign lands, silk had become something larger than fabric. It had become legend. To foreign merchants encountering it for the first time, silk appeared almost unreal compared to wool or linen. It shimmered, flowed, and moved like liquid light. It felt less like cloth and more like captured wealth. And wealth, once discovered, never stays still. Chinese rulers understood its value immediately. For centuries, the secrets of silk production were carefully guarded. Sericulture became protected knowledge, and revealing it to outsiders was treated as a serious offense. The empire guarded silkworms the way other states guarded weapons. The idea that an entire economy depended on tiny insects eating leaves and spinning thread is one of history's quiet absurdities. As silk left China, it entered Persia, a civilization perfectly positioned between East and West. Persian cities became massive trade hubs where silk, spices, cotton, dyes, and furs converged. But Persia did not simply pass goods along. It transformed them. Persian fashion took imported silk and turned it into layered, structured clothing rich with embroidery and symbolism. Long robes, fitted trousers, decorated tunics, and patterned cloaks reflected a society built on mobility, empire, and adaptation. Unlike simpler garments elsewhere, Persian clothing emphasized both elegance and function, shaped by life on horseback and across vast territories. Patterns carried meaning. Colors signaled status. Gold embroidery indicated wealth and authority. Clothing became a visible expression of power, designed to impress instantly and decisively. Silk arriving from the East was not simply worn. It was elevated. Greek and Roman observers often criticized Persian luxury, calling it excessive or soft, yet their criticisms did little to prevent imitation. Fashion rarely listens to judgment. It listens to desire. As silk moved further west into the Mediterranean world, it reached Rome, where it triggered fascination and controversy in equal measure. Roman elites embraced silk immediately. It shimmered under candlelight, draped effortlessly across the body, and created an image of extreme wealth that few other materials could match. At the same time, moralists condemned it. Some argued it weakened traditional values. Others believed it encouraged vanity or indecency. Philosophers debated it. Writers criticized it. Yet demand only grew stronger. Silk became a symbol of contradiction. It represented both luxury and anxiety, admiration and suspicion. Romans did not even fully understand its origin. Some believed it grew on trees. Others imagined it was harvested from plants in distant eastern forests. The truth remained hidden for centuries, protected by distance and secrecy. Meanwhile, the Silk Road itself expanded into a vast network of interconnected routes. It was never a single road but a living system of trade stretching across deserts, mountains, and steppes. In its oasis cities, cultures collided constantly. Chinese merchants brought silk robes decorated with imperial symbolism. Persian traders arrived in embroidered garments shaped by layered traditions. Indian travelers carried cotton and indigo-dyed fabrics. Central Asian nomads wore fur-lined coats and trousers designed for survival in extreme climates. Mediterranean merchants introduced their own textiles and dyes. In these cities, fashion became a shared language. People recognized origin not through speech alone, but through fabric, color, and cut. Clothing revealed geography instantly. Identity was woven into every thread. As exchanges deepened, fashion began to merge. A single garment might contain silk from China, dye from India, embroidery inspired by Persia, and tailoring influenced by steppe nomads. Styles crossed borders without resistance, moving faster than armies or empires ever could. Nomadic cultures played a crucial role in reshaping clothing across Eurasia. Their designs prioritized movement and survival. Trousers, fitted jackets, boots, belts, and layered garments spread gradually into settled societies. At first, they were dismissed as foreign or uncivilized. Eventually, they became essential. Practicality always wins in the long run. Religious movements also influenced Silk Road fashion. Buddhist monks carried robes and textile traditions across Asia. Christian clergy introduced garments emphasizing humility and ritual. Islamic culture later spread styles defined by layered clothing, modesty, and geometric decoration. Faith traveled with fabric, and fabric carried meaning across borders. In Byzantium, silk reached its most ceremonial form. Constantinople transformed clothing into political theater. Imperial robes embroidered with gold, purple dye, crosses, eagles, and saints became symbols of authority and divine legitimacy. Clothing defined hierarchy so precisely that status could be read instantly. Byzantine rulers even developed their own silk production after, according to tradition, silkworm eggs were smuggled out of China in secrecy. Whether legend or fact, the story reflects reality. Silk was valuable enough to inspire espionage. In Byzantine society, silk was not only worn but used as diplomacy. Garments were gifted to foreign rulers as symbols of power and prestige. Clothing became a language of empire. Across centuries, silk moved through civilizations, constantly changing meaning. In China, it represented cosmic order and imperial authority. In Persia, it became layered expression of empire and mobility. In Rome, it symbolized wealth and moral anxiety. In Byzantium, it became sacred political display. Along the Silk Road, it merged into a shared cultural system where textiles carried history itself. Eventually, no single culture owned silk anymore. It belonged to the movement between cultures. The Silk Road did not just trade fabric. It traded identity. It traded aesthetics. It traded ways of seeing the human body itself. And through that endless exchange, civilizations that never met face to face became quietly stitched together. Not through conquest. Not through religion. But through fabric. And in the end, silk did something far greater than dress the ancient world. It connected it. Trade rarely begins with grand intentions. It begins with necessity, and then slowly transforms into something far larger than the people who started it can imagine. Long before borders were drawn in ink or enforced by armies, there was movement. Not of empires, but of goods. Not of conquest, but of curiosity and demand. And among the earliest and most powerful of these movements was silk. But silk, once it left its place of origin, stopped being just fabric. It became a force that reshaped economies, elevated cities, and quietly rewired how distant civilizations understood power itself. It moved beyond borders. And in doing so, it created a world more connected than anyone expected. At its heart, the Silk Road was never a single road. It was a living network of routes stretching across deserts, mountains, grasslands, and oasis cities. Caravans moved slowly, carefully, often in stages rather than journeys. No merchant saw the entire system. Instead, each group only knew their segment, passing goods forward like an endless relay that spanned continents. And within that relay, silk was the most valuable participant. In early exchanges, silk did not behave like ordinary merchandise. It did not degrade in value with distance. It did the opposite. The farther it traveled, the more it gained in worth, mystery, and desirability. By the time it reached distant markets, it had already passed through so many hands that its origin felt almost mythical. This alone changed the logic of ancient trade. Most goods lose identity as they move. Silk gained one. It became a symbol of distance itself. Of access. Of connection to a world beyond the horizon. For Chinese states, silk was more than an export. It was economic strategy. Carefully managed production ensured that supply remained controlled, allowing value to stay high across foreign markets. Entire administrative systems developed around cultivation, weaving, taxation, and storage. Silk was not just produced. It was governed. And governance always follows value. As caravans carried silk westward, it entered regions that were already powerful in their own right. Central Asia became the first major intersection point. Oasis cities emerged along trade routes not because of agriculture or conquest, but because water and geography allowed them to survive in otherwise harsh environments. These cities became essential refueling points for trade, and therefore essential points of cultural exchange. Markets in these cities were not orderly spaces of simple commerce. They were collisions of worlds. A merchant from the east might arrive wearing fine silk robes, carrying lacquered goods and unfamiliar spices. A trader from the steppe might bring horses, furs, and leather crafted for survival in extreme climates. From the south came cotton textiles and vibrant dyes. From the west arrived metalwork, glass, and luxury goods shaped by Mediterranean craftsmanship. And all of it passed through the same crowded marketplaces, under the same sun, in the same dust-filled air. In these environments, silk began to change meaning. It was no longer just a Chinese product. It became a shared language of wealth. A merchant did not need to speak another tongue to understand silk's value. Its texture, weight, and shimmer communicated instantly. Silk was already translating itself. Persia became the great transformer within this system. Positioned between east and west, it absorbed goods from both directions and reshaped them into something distinctly its own. Persian cities were not passive checkpoints. They were creative hubs where imported materials were reimagined. Silk arriving from the east did not remain untouched. It was woven into new styles, combined with local patterns, and adapted into clothing that reflected the structure of Persian society. Here, fashion was not simply personal expression. It was political identity. Long robes, layered garments, embroidered details, and structured tailoring reflected an empire that valued both mobility and authority. The clothing was designed for a world of courts, cavalry, and administration spread across vast territories. Color carried meaning. Gold signified power. Deep reds and blues reflected status and wealth. Intricate patterns suggested refinement, control, and cultural sophistication. Clothing became a visible hierarchy. And silk sat at the top of that hierarchy. Greek and later Roman observers often viewed Persian luxury with suspicion. They interpreted elaborate clothing as excess or weakness. Yet even as they criticized it, they adopted elements of it. Trade rarely respects cultural judgment. It follows desirability. By the time silk reached the Mediterranean world, it had already passed through centuries of transformation. What arrived in Rome was not just fabric, but reputation. A material wrapped in stories of distance, luxury, and foreign sophistication. The reaction in Rome was immediate and divided. Elite society embraced silk with enthusiasm. It draped elegantly, shimmered under light, and created a visual effect unlike anything produced by local textiles. It became a marker of wealth so clear that it needed no explanation. But alongside admiration came anxiety. Moralists argued that silk represented excess. That it weakened traditional values. That it blurred boundaries of modesty and discipline. Philosophers criticized it. Writers debated it. Political voices warned against it. Yet demand only increased. Because silk, once seen, was difficult to forget. It created a tension that ran through Roman society. On one side, tradition. On the other, aspiration. And silk stood in the middle, quietly pulling both toward itself. Even its origin became a subject of speculation. Without knowledge of silkworm cultivation, theories filled the gap. Some believed silk grew on trees. Others thought it was combed from plants or collected from distant natural sources in the east. The truth remained distant enough to preserve the mystery. And mystery, in trade, is often more powerful than knowledge. As Silk Road networks expanded, movement intensified. Goods no longer traveled in simple lines but in branching chains of exchange. No single empire controlled the entire system. Instead, control was distributed across countless intermediaries, caravan leaders, city officials, translators, artisans, and merchants. Power became decentralized, yet deeply connected. What emerged was not a single economic system, but an interlocking web of regional systems that depended on each other without fully understanding the whole structure. Silk sat at the center of that web. It moved through steppe territories where nomadic cultures shaped the rhythm of travel. It passed through Persian trade hubs where it was refined and repackaged. It entered Indian ports where new dyes and weaving traditions expanded its visual language. It reached Byzantine cities where it became ceremonial and political. Every empire that encountered silk changed it. And in return, silk changed them. Nomadic cultures introduced practicality into fashion systems that had once prioritized form over function. Trousers, boots, fitted jackets, and layered garments spread gradually into settled civilizations. At first, these designs were dismissed. Later, they became essential. Movement proved more durable than tradition. Religious networks also carried influence along trade routes. Monks, scholars, and travelers brought clothing traditions shaped by belief systems. These garments were not only symbolic. They were adaptive, designed for long journeys, varied climates, and cross-cultural interaction. Through them, ideas of modesty, identity, and ritual appearance spread across continents. Byzantium represents one of the most refined expressions of Silk Road exchange. Here, silk became political theater. Clothing was carefully regulated, layered with meaning, and designed to communicate hierarchy instantly. Court life transformed fashion into performance, where every garment signaled rank, authority, and connection to imperial power. In this environment, silk was not just worn. It was staged. Stories even describe how Byzantium eventually secured its own silk production through the covert acquisition of silkworms from the east. Whether fully accurate or partly mythologized, the narrative reflects the reality of silk's importance. It was worth protecting, stealing, and reinventing. Across all these regions, silk functioned as more than trade goods. It became a medium through which civilizations negotiated identity, prestige, and influence. It carried economic value, but also symbolic weight. It signaled not just wealth, but access to distant worlds. Not just beauty, but connection. Not just clothing, but participation in a system that stretched far beyond any single empire's control. And perhaps the most remarkable aspect of all this is how quietly it happened. There were no declarations announcing global connection. No unified design shaping exchange. No single authority guiding movement across continents. Instead, there were countless individual decisions. A merchant choosing a route. A buyer choosing a fabric. A craftsman adapting a pattern. A traveler carrying an idea across a border without realizing its significance. Layer by layer, interaction by interaction, the ancient world stitched itself together. And silk was the thread running through it all. Beyond borders, beyond empires, beyond language and law, it created a shared system of value and desire that linked civilizations that would otherwise have remained separate. In the end, silk was never just traded. It was transferred, transformed, and translated. And through it, the ancient world learned a quiet truth that no empire fully controlled, but all of them eventually experienced. Connection travels faster than conquest. And fabric can hold an empire together longer than armies ever could. Trade in the ancient world rarely began as an ambition. It began as movement, slow, uncertain, and often unplanned. Goods changed hands not because someone designed a global system, but because distance created desire, and desire created value. Among all the materials that traveled across continents, few reshaped the ancient world as completely as silk. At first, it was simply a fabric produced in a distant region of East Asia, where early artisans discovered that the delicate cocoons of silkworms could be unraveled into long, continuous threads. Those threads were then spun, woven, and transformed into cloth so smooth and luminous that it seemed to defy comparison with anything else known at the time. But silk did not remain local for long. Once it entered long-distance exchange networks, it began a transformation of its own. It stopped being just a textile and became an economic force. Silk's value did not diminish with distance. It increased. Every stage of travel added cost, mystery, and prestige. By the time it reached faraway markets, it had passed through multiple intermediaries, each embedding their own mark on its price and perception. What emerged was a product whose worth was not tied only to material, but to geography itself. Distance became part of its identity. In early imperial China, silk production evolved into a carefully managed system. It was not simply a craft but an organized industry supported by state oversight. Sericulture required knowledge of mulberry cultivation, silkworm breeding, controlled harvesting, and precise weaving techniques. Over time, entire regions specialized in its production, creating a structured economic base that supported both local livelihoods and imperial authority. Silk was more than fabric within this system. It was currency in disguise. It was used in taxation, diplomatic exchange, and rewards for service. Officials were compensated in silk bolts. Alliances were reinforced through silk gifts. Foreign relations were partially maintained through controlled distribution of luxury textiles. The state understood something fundamental: controlling silk meant controlling value that extended beyond borders. As trade routes expanded westward, silk entered Central Asia, where it encountered a world defined by mobility and exchange. Oasis cities emerged along these routes not as political capitals, but as economic nodes. They survived because trade passed through them. Water, geography, and timing turned them into essential stops in a vast commercial network. In these cities, silk became a universal language of value. A merchant did not need shared speech to recognize its worth. Its texture, weight, and sheen communicated immediately. It could be exchanged for horses, spices, metals, or services, often functioning as a medium of high-value trade where coins were impractical. Silk effectively operated as a trans-regional asset, portable wealth that could cross deserts and mountains without losing significance. Persia occupied a central position within this system, acting as both conduit and transformer. Rather than simply moving goods forward, Persian markets reinterpreted them. Imported silk was woven into local traditions, reshaped into garments that reflected the structure of Persian society and its political hierarchy. Clothing here was not casual expression. It was structured visibility. Robes, layered garments, and finely embroidered textiles indicated rank and influence. Materials, colors, and decorative motifs were carefully chosen to reflect status. Gold thread suggested authority. Deep dyes signaled wealth. Complex patterns communicated refinement and access to long-distance trade networks. Silk became the highest tier within this visual economy. Greek and later Roman observers often interpreted Persian luxury as excess, contrasting it with their own ideals of simplicity. Yet these judgments did not prevent adoption. Trade has a way of bypassing moral commentary. What is desired eventually becomes normalized. When silk reached the Mediterranean world, it entered an economy already deeply familiar with luxury goods, but not with anything quite like this. In Rome, silk immediately became a marker of elite consumption. It altered how wealth was displayed. Unlike heavier local fabrics, silk draped fluidly, reflected light subtly, and created a visual effect that communicated refinement without needing ornamentation. Its presence in clothing changed the language of status. To wear silk was to signal access to distant trade networks and extraordinary wealth. It was not just fashion, it was participation in a system of long-distance exchange that only the richest individuals could access. At the same time, silk generated economic tension. Roman writers and moral commentators criticized it as a symbol of excess and foreign influence. They associated it with luxury that could undermine traditional values. Yet these critiques existed alongside rising demand. The contradiction itself reveals silk's economic power. It was both condemned and consumed. This duality, moral resistance paired with market expansion, helped increase its value even further. Controversy, in effect, became part of its branding. Silk also reshaped trade balances. Large quantities of wealth flowed eastward in exchange for luxury fabrics. Roman elites paid heavily for imports, creating economic pressure that ancient writers observed with concern. Silk was not just a product entering Rome, it was a resource draining out of it. Across Eurasia, silk functioned as a stabilizing and destabilizing force simultaneously. It connected economies that had no political unity, creating dependency across vast distances. Empires did not control the system, yet they were deeply shaped by it. Central Asia remained the backbone of this exchange. Caravan cities acted as intermediaries, facilitating not only trade but cultural adaptation. Goods were repackaged, reinterpreted, and redistributed. Silk changed hands multiple times, and each transfer added value while also embedding cultural influence. This constant movement created a layered economy where value was accumulated through exchange rather than production alone. Silk also influenced labor systems. Entire communities specialized in weaving, dyeing, transporting, and trading textiles. Skills were passed through generations, forming occupational identities tied directly to the Silk Road economy. Economic life became increasingly interconnected across regions that remained politically separate. As silk moved further west, it continued to transform. In Byzantium, it became deeply integrated into imperial administration and ceremonial life. Clothing was not just status display but institutional structure. Court hierarchy could be read through garments alone. Colors, embroidery patterns, and fabric types were regulated with precision, reinforcing political order through visual codes. Silk here became both economic asset and administrative tool. Byzantine control over silk production further demonstrated its strategic importance. The establishment of local weaving centers reduced reliance on long-distance imports, integrating silk directly into state economy and diplomacy. Luxury textiles were used as diplomatic gifts, reinforcing alliances and projecting imperial authority across foreign courts. Across all these regions, silk consistently functioned as more than material goods. It acted as a medium through which economies expressed hierarchy, controlled value, and negotiated power. Its economic role was inseparable from its social meaning. Because silk was never just purchased for necessity. It was purchased for recognition. For distinction. For visibility within systems of hierarchy that defined ancient life. And that is what made it powerful. It did not simply circulate wealth. It structured how wealth was seen. Even more importantly, silk blurred the line between economy and identity. A person wearing silk was not just displaying ownership of an expensive material. They were displaying participation in a vast, interconnected system of trade that stretched across continents. In that sense, silk functioned as a thread connecting not only economies, but entire civilizations. And those threads, once woven together, became difficult to separate. Empires rose and fell. Borders shifted. Trade routes changed. But silk kept moving. And wherever it moved, it left behind a world slightly more connected, slightly more complex, and permanently changed by the quiet power of a single thread. It begins in silence. Not the silence of emptiness, but the quiet persistence of life happening on a scale too small to notice. Inside a mulberry grove in ancient China, tiny silkworms feed, grow, and spin delicate cocoons. At first glance, nothing about this process suggests empire, trade routes, or the rise of global luxury. It looks like nature repeating itself, indifferent to history. And yet, inside those fragile cocoons lies one of the most influential materials the ancient world would ever encounter. A thread so fine it seems almost unreal. So smooth it catches light instead of simply reflecting it. Strong enough to be woven into cloth that would travel farther than most people ever could. Silk did not announce its importance. It earned it quietly, one strand at a time. In early Chinese civilization, the ability to produce silk became a carefully guarded knowledge. It was not just a craft but a controlled practice embedded within the structure of the state. Families and regions specialized in sericulture, mastering the delicate balance of feeding, harvesting, and unraveling the cocoons into continuous thread. What emerged from this process was not just fabric, but refinement itself made visible. Silk garments quickly became markers of status within Chinese society. The elite wore robes that shimmered with subtle movement, colored and embroidered with symbolic meaning. Dragons represented imperial authority, phoenixes suggested harmony and renewal, and intricate cloud patterns reflected cosmic order. Clothing did not simply dress the body, it positioned the wearer within the structure of the universe. In this early stage, silk already functioned as more than material. It was identity, hierarchy, and authority woven into cloth. But silk was never meant to stay in one place. As trade networks slowly expanded westward during the Han period, silk began its long journey beyond China. It moved along caravan routes that stitched together deserts, mountain passes, and scattered oasis cities across Central Asia. No single traveler carried it end to end. Instead, it passed through a chain of merchants, each adding distance, cost, and value. By the time silk reached foreign lands, it had transformed into something larger than fabric. It had become reputation made tangible. To those encountering it for the first time, silk appeared almost unreal. Compared to wool or linen, it moved differently, shone differently, felt different. It was light yet strong, delicate yet enduring. It did not behave like ordinary cloth. It behaved like something rare enough to change perception. And rarity is the foundation of desire. Chinese authorities understood this immediately. Silk production was protected with unusual seriousness, treated almost like a strategic resource. The process was controlled, knowledge was restricted, and the origin of silk remained a closely held secret for centuries. In a world where most innovations spread through imitation, silk remained deliberately isolated at its source. Yet secrecy cannot contain demand forever. As silk moved westward, it entered the vast intermediary world of Central Asia. Here, oasis cities became essential nodes in a growing network of exchange. These settlements were not destinations in themselves but necessary pauses in a much larger system of movement. Caravans arrived, rested, traded, and moved on, while goods were redistributed along new routes. In these cities, silk began to lose its purely Chinese identity. It became something shared, circulated, and reinterpreted. Markets brought together merchants from vastly different worlds. Chinese traders arrived with silk and lacquerware. Indian merchants carried cotton and indigo. Steppe nomads brought horses, furs, and leather. Persian traders introduced refined textiles and decorative traditions. Mediterranean merchants brought metalwork, glass, and luxury goods shaped by entirely different histories. In this convergence, silk became a universal language of value. No translation was required. Its worth was understood immediately. Persia played a crucial role in shaping silk's transformation. Positioned between East and West, it absorbed goods from multiple directions and reworked them into distinct cultural forms. Imported silk was not simply traded onward, it was redesigned, reinterpreted, and elevated. Persian fashion developed into a sophisticated system of layered garments, embroidered textiles, and structured clothing designed for both mobility and authority. Long robes, fitted trousers, and richly decorated cloaks reflected an empire built on administration, cavalry, and long-distance governance. Here, clothing was not just appearance. It was structure. Silk became part of that structure, integrated into a visual language of power. Colors carried meaning. Gold suggested authority. Deep reds and blues indicated wealth and prestige. Complex patterns reflected access to skilled artisans and long-distance trade networks. Silk was no longer foreign here. It had become essential. As it continued westward, silk reached the Mediterranean world, where it entered a different kind of society, one deeply aware of luxury, yet unsettled by its own attraction to it. In Rome, silk immediately became a symbol of elite consumption. It changed the visual economy of wealth. Unlike heavier local fabrics, silk moved with lightness and fluidity. It created an impression of effortless elegance that was difficult to replicate with any other material. To wear silk was to signal participation in a distant, expensive, and exclusive system of trade. But alongside admiration came unease. Roman writers criticized silk as excessive, foreign, and morally questionable. Some argued it weakened traditional values. Others believed it encouraged vanity or softened character. Philosophers debated its influence. Moralists warned against it. Yet demand continued to grow. Silk did not need approval. It only needed visibility. Even its origin remained mysterious to many in the Mediterranean world. Without knowledge of silkworm cultivation, theories filled the gap. Some believed silk grew on trees. Others imagined it was gathered from plants or spun by natural forces in distant eastern lands. The truth remained hidden not because it was complex, but because it was far away. Distance itself became part of silk's identity. Across Eurasia, the Silk Road functioned not as a single road, but as a shifting network of connected routes. Goods moved through multiple hands, languages, and cultures before reaching their final destinations. At each stage, silk was revalued, reinterpreted, and recontextualized. What made the system remarkable was not central control, but continuous exchange. No empire governed the entire network. Instead, countless intermediaries maintained it: caravan leaders, city officials, translators, artisans, and merchants. Together, they formed an economic system larger than any single political authority. Silk sat at the center of this system, not as a controlled asset, but as a continuously circulating one. In Central Asian cities, cultural blending became inevitable. Clothing styles merged across traditions. A traveler might wear garments combining Eastern silk, Persian tailoring, nomadic practicality, and local decorative patterns. Identity became readable, but no longer fixed. Nomadic cultures contributed fundamentally to this transformation. Their clothing systems, designed for mobility and survival, introduced trousers, fitted jackets, boots, and layered garments into regions where draped clothing had once dominated. At first dismissed, these designs eventually spread widely because they worked better in motion. Function slowly reshaped tradition. Religious movements also carried textile traditions across continents. Buddhist monks, Christian clergy, and later Islamic scholars moved through Silk Road networks wearing garments shaped by belief, environment, and travel. These clothing systems influenced local styles while also adapting to them, creating new hybrid forms. By the time silk reached Byzantium, it had entered a world where clothing functioned as political language. In Constantinople, silk became ceremonial architecture. Imperial robes were designed to communicate rank, authority, and divine legitimacy instantly. Gold embroidery, purple dye, and religious symbolism turned garments into structured displays of power. Hierarchy was not hidden. It was worn. Byzantine control of silk production further reinforced its importance. Whether through trade, diplomacy, or legend, silk remained tied to statecraft. Luxury textiles were used as gifts, diplomatic tools, and symbols of imperial presence across foreign courts. Across all these transformations, silk remained constant in one role: connection. It linked economies without unifying them. It linked cultures without erasing them. It linked empires without belonging to any one of them. And that is what made it extraordinary. Silk was never just a product moving along trade routes. It was a system of transformation. From cocoon to kingdoms, it carried more than material value. It carried meaning, identity, and influence across distances that once seemed impossible to bridge. And in doing so, it quietly helped shape a world far more connected than the empires that inhabited it ever realized. Silk did not begin as a symbol of connection. It began as something small enough to ignore. Inside the mulberry groves of ancient China, silkworms fed quietly, spun their cocoons, and completed a cycle that looked entirely natural, almost forgettable. Nothing about it suggested empires, trade systems, or cultural transformation. It was simply life repeating itself in a corner of the natural world. And yet, inside those cocoons was a thread that would travel farther than most armies, outlive many kingdoms, and quietly reshape how civilizations saw each other. Silk was never loud in its arrival. It was powerful in its consequences. In early Chinese society, silk production developed into a refined and carefully controlled practice. It required patience, observation, and a deep understanding of natural cycles. Silkworms depended on mulberry cultivation, controlled environments, and precise harvesting techniques. Over time, entire regions specialized in this craft, turning it into both an economic foundation and a cultural identity. Within China, silk became more than material. It became meaning. Clothing made from silk was not simply worn, it was interpreted. Colors, weaving patterns, and embroidered symbols communicated rank, philosophy, and alignment with cosmic order. Dragons, phoenixes, clouds, and celestial motifs were not decoration alone, they were visual language. A robe could indicate authority before a word was spoken. Silk was already acting as communication. But its greatest transformation began when it moved. As trade routes expanded westward during the Han period, silk began its journey beyond China. It traveled along vast networks of caravan paths crossing deserts, mountains, and scattered oasis settlements. No single traveler carried it from origin to destination. Instead, it moved in stages, passing through countless hands, each adding distance, cost, and meaning. By the time silk reached distant civilizations, it was no longer just fabric. It was a story told through trade. To those encountering it for the first time, silk seemed almost unreal. Compared to wool, linen, or leather, it behaved differently. It shimmered with lightness, draped with fluid precision, and carried a softness that felt almost unnatural. It was not just rare. It felt unfamiliar in a way that made it desirable. And desire is where exchange begins. Chinese authorities understood the value of this rarity. Silk production was carefully protected, with knowledge passed through controlled channels. For centuries, the origins of silk remained hidden from the outside world. In a time when most technologies spread through imitation, silk remained intentionally guarded, preserved as a source of economic and political strength. Yet secrecy could not stop movement. As silk entered Central Asia, it became part of a much larger system of exchange. Oasis cities emerged along trade routes as essential stopping points. These were not centers of empire, but centers of passage. Goods arrived, were exchanged, and continued onward. In these cities, silk began to change identity. Markets brought together people from entirely different worlds. Chinese merchants carried silk and lacquerware. Indian traders brought cotton and indigo. Steppe nomads arrived with horses, leather, and furs. Persian traders introduced intricate textiles and decorative traditions. Mediterranean merchants added metalwork, glass, and luxury goods shaped by distant histories. Silk existed in the middle of this exchange, immediately recognizable in value even when languages failed. It required no translation. Persia became one of silk's most important transforming regions. Positioned between East and West, it absorbed goods from both directions and reshaped them into distinct cultural forms. Silk arriving here did not remain unchanged. It was woven into new styles, combined with local aesthetics, and integrated into clothing systems that reflected imperial structure. In Persian society, clothing was deeply tied to identity and authority. Garments were structured, layered, and richly decorated. Long robes, fitted trousers, embroidered tunics, and patterned cloaks reflected a culture built on administration, cavalry, and long-distance governance. Silk became the highest expression of this system. Colors carried meaning. Deep red suggested power. Gold indicated authority and wealth. Complex embroidery reflected access to skilled artisans and long trade networks. Clothing became a visible hierarchy, and silk sat at its peak. Greek and Roman observers often criticized Persian luxury, interpreting it as excess. Yet criticism rarely interrupts influence. Over time, elements of Persian fashion spread outward, absorbed quietly through contact and trade. When silk reached the Mediterranean world, it entered a society already familiar with luxury, but not with anything quite like this. In Rome, silk immediately became a marker of elite status. It transformed how wealth was displayed. Unlike heavier local textiles, silk moved with lightness and reflected light in subtle, shifting ways. It created an effect that was both elegant and unmistakably expensive. To wear silk was to signal access to distant worlds. But admiration came with tension. Roman writers criticized silk as foreign, excessive, and morally questionable. Some argued it weakened traditional values. Others believed it promoted vanity or softness. Philosophers debated it. Moralists condemned it. Yet demand continued to grow. Silk became both admired and distrusted at the same time. Even its origin was uncertain to many in the Mediterranean world. Without knowledge of silkworm cultivation, speculation filled the gap. Some believed silk grew on trees. Others imagined it came from plants or natural fibers gathered in distant eastern lands. The truth remained distant enough to preserve mystery. And mystery strengthens value. Across Eurasia, the Silk Road functioned not as a single route, but as a vast network of interconnected paths. Goods moved through multiple intermediaries before reaching their final destinations. At each stage, silk was revalued, reinterpreted, and recontextualized. No empire controlled the system. Instead, countless individuals maintained it: caravan leaders, translators, artisans, city officials, and merchants. Together, they formed an economic structure larger than any single political power. Silk sat at the center of this structure, constantly in motion, constantly being transformed. In Central Asian cities, cultural blending became inevitable. Clothing styles merged across regions. A single outfit might combine Eastern silk, Persian tailoring, nomadic practicality, and local decorative motifs. Identity became visible, but no longer fixed. Nomadic cultures contributed significantly to this transformation. Their clothing systems prioritized movement and survival. Trousers, boots, fitted jackets, and layered garments spread gradually into settled societies. At first dismissed, they later became essential because they worked. Function reshaped fashion. Religious networks also carried textile traditions across continents. Buddhist monks, Christian clergy, and later Islamic scholars traveled with garments shaped by belief and environment. These clothing systems influenced local fashion while adapting to it, creating new hybrid styles that reflected both faith and geography. By the time silk reached Byzantium, it had become something more than trade goods. It had become political language. In Constantinople, silk was transformed into ceremonial structure. Imperial robes, embroidered with gold and purple dye, communicated authority, rank, and divine legitimacy instantly. Clothing became a system of visible hierarchy. Nothing about it was accidental. Byzantine control of silk production reinforced its importance further. Whether through trade, diplomacy, or legendary accounts of silkworms being smuggled from the east, silk remained tied to state power. It was used as diplomatic gift, economic resource, and symbol of imperial prestige. Across all these transformations, silk maintained a single function: connection. It linked economies that had no shared governance. It linked cultures that had no shared language. It linked empires that often did not understand each other, yet still traded daily. Silk did not erase difference. It moved through it. And in doing so, it created something larger than commerce. It created continuity. From China's silkworms to Roman markets, from Persian workshops to Byzantine courts, silk carried more than fabric. It carried exchange itself, the steady, invisible process through which civilizations became aware of one another. And that is why silk matters. Not because it was rare, but because it moved. And in moving, it connected a world that was never truly separate, only waiting to be stitched together one thread at a time.